here. Knock, knock.
There it is. I was gonna say it should pop right up here. There you are.
Damn, we're all in different shapes. It's so weird.
Good stuff.
All right, so if everyone is ready, everyone good to go? Everyone need to get some water or anything?
I think I'm good over here.
All right, so first, I want to thank you guys for being here. I know some of you, at least for Tiberius, we messaged him last minute and he came in clutch. Same thing with Sanso, so thank you guys so much for that. We really appreciate it. So the way this will work, 2 topics. 1 hour each, but as for right now, we're doing 2 hours for the first topic, and if we get to it, we can get the we can sneak in COVID if we can. I will let each panelist introduce themselves, their political leanings, where to find them, all that stuff. After which I will present the topic. Then each panelist gets to give their thoughts on the topic with their short intro. After the hour has ended, I will then ask each panelist to give their closing thoughts. 2 minutes for intro and outro. I'll be moderating, and I'll interject sometimes. Maybe if there's like a miscommunication, maybe I can clear things up, or if things are getting a little bit crazy and I need to sort things out and choose who goes next and so on and so forth. As language goes, I like what Dylan says. I'm not going to moderate niceness, but obviously, guys, I don't think anybody here is going to do it. But no racist slurs, Twitch guidelines as usual. So let's get to the first topic. Oh, actually, no, not first topic. Let's go ahead and introduce ourselves really quickly. So we'll start with Rob. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, my name's Rob Noor. I'm on YouTube, though I'm temporarily banned, D Live, Twitch, and then when I start doing short videos, I'll be on other panels as well. So it's either Normal America with Rob Noor, or on Twitch, I'm just Rob Noor, as you see it spelled there, all one word, lowercase. I'd call myself a conservative populist. I started doing this channel because I didn't see a lot of people in rural America having a voice much in the country, and I thought that because the people I love, I'm not good at the things they're good at. I'm good at talking. So this is something I wanted to do to try to kind of bring their perspective to light. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
All right. Sansol?
Hi, I'm Sansol. I am a left-leaning, omni-liberal soy boy cuck who likes to argue with dumb motherfuckers on the internet. I am very prolific in this, and I play video games sometimes. Right now, I'm on a villain arc where I am going to go hard on everyone. So good luck to all the panelists.
All right. Tiberius D.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tiberius D. I'm a geopolitical analyst. I basically do a show that is geopolitics. We just got done doing an episode with Israel. Feel free to check that out. As far as my political leanings, I've been called pretty much everything under the sun, and I've kind of embraced it as the omnipath. I just do everything a little bit at a time. I do have more sympathies with the right, but that only is about skin deep. So we'll see where that goes.
All right, Joe Lewis.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. Sorry, I have a Twitch channel, excuse me. Twitch.tv/Joe Lewis. O being a 0. I'm just a music teacher. My political leanings, it kind of varies based on the space. I tend to be too left for the righties and too right for the lefties. So, but that will make me moderate then, I guess. But it tends to be towards the left side usually.
All right, sounds good. So let's go ahead and get into the first topic. All right, so whiteness. Whiteness has been a topic gaining ground in today's politics. Rejecting whiteness and the idea of white privilege go hand in hand. With everything happening, such as the George Floyd court case starting and the rise in Asian hate crimes, along with recent shootings, critical race theory, white fragility, etc. It seems like white people, or whiteness as a whole, are taking a lot of heat in today's politics. Panelists, what does whiteness mean? White privilege? And what are your thoughts on this movement as a whole? We'll go ahead and start with Rob Noor. 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that whiteness and the idea of rejecting whiteness is just an excuse used by establishment people, the people that run this country, to divide us, to take away attention from the fact that they basically have failed us as average Americans of all skin colors for the past 40 to 50 years. And so they understand by creating divisions based on other things, it avoids us from coming together and understanding that they they've screwed us over in other ways. A lot of the people that talk about rejecting whiteness are just flat out racist. They're talking about particularly disparaging people and forcing people to be responsible of the sins of their fathers based solely on their skin color. Whiteness is something that's amorphous. People don't have a standard definition for it. So some people say, when I say reject whiteness, it just means this, but then they or other people will change that definition when it fits them politically. This is just sanctioned racism. It's absolutely despicable and deplorable, and we should reject at all cost identifying people and judging people based on the skin color, and instead judge them based on the content of their character.
All right, let's go ahead and go with Joel Lewis. 2 minutes, sir.
Yeah, whiteness is a pretty simple definition. I'm going to simplify it in interest of time. It's just practices in society that produce white privilege. And then when you bring the microscope a little bit farther, white privilege, in its simplest possible terms, is just a mode of the societal hierarchy that prioritizes the wants, needs, and desires of white people. Now, one thing that gets kind of lost in the conversation when we're talking about whiteness specifically is that whiteness isn't exclusive to white people. That anybody can participate in whiteness and the perpetuation of whiteness in society. I think rejecting it would be rejecting the practices that create white privilege, right? So that's where I stand on that. Now we can get into the whole like nitty gritty, and we probably will, about like examples of these practices and how they lead into white privilege. I think it's a really good thing for people to understand. But inherently, that's all it is. So just so we're very clear for the sake of the conversation, for me and a lot of, whether it be people who observe CRT, when it spans out to things within law or sociology and all the in between, it's just in the simplest possible terms for whiteness, practices in society that produce white privilege, and then for white privilege, just a mode of the social hierarchy that has the impact, a mode of the social hierarchy that prioritizes the wants, needs, desires, and expectations of white people. But yeah, that's all I got.
Well said. All right, let's go to Tiberius D. 2 minutes, sir.
All right. So, as far as what whiteness is, it's weird. It's nebulous. It changes. What it means to me, I cannot give you a definitive, because I actually think there's a lot of people that care more about my whiteness than I do. So I have never really metabolized what that actually means to me. So I'm sorry, I guess. But there is something very interesting here that I'll fire off with the opening remarks, and that is that the idea of whiteness is kind of new. When this country was originally founded, we were Anglo. We were largely this British split-off nation that said we weren't treated right, so we're going to make it for ourselves. But when we brought in a bunch of other people that were not considered Anglo, we kind of built out this American white thing that's really nebulous and weird, and it's changed and evolved. It used to be that it was just an Anglo country, but then Germans showed up, and now they're 33% of most people's ethnic inheritance. The French were always here. They make up like 20% of the ethnic inheritance, and it just rolls on there from here. We've got Italians and Poles and Russians and all kinds of people that have kind of combobulated into this massive group that we just call American white. But what does that actually mean? I can't really tell you, because it's moving and changing. And I don't know where one begins and the next one ends. So as far as that general level, that's what I look at in terms of whiteness. As far as white privilege, well, I mean, I think as a statistician would look at it, is that, do white people perform well? Yeah, they do. There's people that perform under them, and there's people that perform better than them. I can make a good example to say, all right, cool, white people do better than black people. We see that economically, socioeconomically, politically, pretty much across the board. However, what does bother me with this conversation is I never hear anything about Asian privilege that makes, on average, $20,000 more than white people do, or Jews that make $20,000 more than them. There's a level where I completely say it's loaded, and there's another level where I'm like, all right, there's a legitimate conversation here. So I hope we get into it. Thank you, Aftershock.
Nice. All right, let's go to Mr. Sonsel. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so I think that often, number one, I really like the way that Joe was defining everything. I think that I agree with everything that he said. I think that oftentimes people will use white privilege or whiteness as without actually knowing what it means. And this leads to a lot of confusion and a lot of divisiveness, just to kind of speak to what Rob was saying. But it's not divisiveness for the reason that you guys think. White privilege is a thing. Whiteness is a thing. It's something that we can apply to broader society, but isn't really very useful when applying it to individuals. There are white people in Appalachia that are super poor, right? So they're probably not as privileged as someone like Michael Jordan, right? But there's different things that are that you get for your privilege out of whiteness, and there's different things that you get privilege out of prosperity and wealth. So those are the things that I kind of focus on in terms of talking about white privilege and whiteness and privilege and all of these different things. And I think that's all I really have to say to it about it, because Joe is so eloquent in his opening.
Okay, so before we get into the roundtable discussion, just let you guys know, when I talk, everybody stays quiet, okay? If it keeps going, I'm going to have to mute. But other than that, all right, go ahead, guys.
All right, so I guess to start with, my question to Joe would be this. Do you think that we have institutions in this country that are propping up a system of white privilege? Do you think that's part of what whiteness is?
Well, yeah, that's what I said in my opening, right? So whiteness is the practices that lead to white privilege, right? So you can have a practice where on its face it could be sort of what we described earlier as nebulous and might not have the impact that we think, but it's about the impact of these things and what they produce. And that's really what makes whiteness really elusive, because when we start really looking at the practices that lead to white privilege, then that's where it gets really messy. But I don't think society as a whole is functioning in a way where like you can visually, how do I word this, where you can visually see white privilege in the way that you described it in that question.
Okay, so then the question becomes, if we have a system that was set up of whiteness that's set up to prop up white privilege, why are whites not at the top of that system?
Whites are at the top of that system.
No, they're not.
What do you have an example of whites not being
what
at the
measure
top of that
do you want to
system?
use? Incarceration, right? Education rates, incarceration rates,
Well, we
median
gotta,
income rates.
well, we have to also ask the question, like, what do we look into society as an inherently good thing and an inherently bad thing, right? As Tiberius laid out, like you want to be economically well off in society. That's a good thing. But when we look at the wealth distribution in the United States, it skews towards white people, regardless of their educational background, being on top of the age earning. So what that looks like, right?
That's not true.
No, it's a little bit more nuanced than just saying it's not true, because it's a little more.
I have the
complicated.
data. If you want,
well,
we can go to the data.
I have the data.
Asian Americans, Okay, well, Tiberius already said, but we could pull up the data if you want.
Right,
Jewish Americans, Asian Americans, Filipino Americans, all sorts of ethnicities outperform white Americans. If this system was set up, it's a great question. Great question. I'm not the one that's saying that these disparities prove racism. There's all sorts of reasons that we should look in. The reason that there are economic disparities between different ethnicities. The counter argument, the argument that's being made is, oh, well, the system is white supremacist or white privilege, and so it exists to benefit white people. So how is it that these other ethnicities are able to overcome that whiteness and outperform white people?
Well, something that you're doing here, which is, hang on, there's something you're doing here that's very kind of tricky and elusive, right? Is that you're confusing race with ethnicity, right? We can break down ethnicities and all the ethnicities and everybody who comes within the United States based on their ethnic background, and we'll see those differences that you're laying out. People who come from the Philippines are going to have different types of earnings relative to people who come from China, relative to people who come from Japan. That's all true. However, even when you lay out for Asian Americans, their wealth disparity within their ethnic groups is wider than any racial class in the United States, including white Americans.
And nonetheless, when you look at the race of Asian Americans overall, they outperform the race of whites overall. If we look at specific ethnicity, yes, they do.
They don't in terms of earnings.
Okay, we'll bring up the data then. That's fine.
But here's the thing: like, if we look at the degree earnings, right? When we look at like a bachelor's degree versus a high school diploma versus a master's degree and a doctorate degree, you'll see that each racial category excels differently. But the one thing that remains true is that white Americans overall, when you look from a high school diploma all the way to a doctoral degree, they, across each level of the educational success, still are better off than any other racial category. Now, granted, there are some fluctuations there, right? As an example, as Latinx and Hispanic Americans tend to have higher earnings at the high school level. So if you get a high school diploma, your earnings are significantly higher than those of any other racial category. But as you go up that, right, when you go up to high school or bachelor's degree, master's degree, doctorate degree, you start seeing the taper down. For Asian Americans, that tends to swell up. For white Americans, they tend to be already in the realm of being financially well off regardless of their educational background, which is something of concern. Because on one hand, you could look at Black Americans as an example, and you'll see that Black Americans, as they increase educational levels, their earnings jump by incredible margins. But then when you look at other racial categories, it doesn't happen. So the question is, and one question that we have is like, why do these phenomenons happen? Where for Black Americans, the difference between getting a high school degree and a bachelor's degree is a significant jump in income. But then when you look at for white Americans, they already start off significantly higher than Black Americans. And then as they get degrees, they still outclass white Americans in each of those categories. Well, versus for Asian Americans, it's a bit more strange because they start out kind of financially well, but then they flatline at the master's and doctoral level.
Okay, so what you see is something that you often see with people that want to talk about these disparities. They want to look in the most nuanced ways anytime that their cult is disproved and their racist ideology is disproved. So if we're looking at just median income, we can see that Asian Americans significantly outperform. And then the answer is, but if we look at Asian Americans in this one particular subsect, so Asian Americans that actually don't have a high school diploma are underperforming to white Americans that don't have a high school diploma. Well, that might be true, but that just shows that the disparity is even more stark, because that proves, because on average, the median income Asian Americans so outperform whites, that's proving that more Asian Americans disproportionately are getting higher education. Because if you start to look at education numbers, it turns out whether in almost all levels of secondary education, Asian Americans are outperforming whites, such as getting into Ivy League schools, getting bachelor's degrees, getting master's degrees, getting doctorates. Asian Americans tend to outperform whites at all of these subsets, right? So what Joe's trying to do is say, he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. He's trying to say there's a system propped up by white people to ensure white people remain at the top. But it is quite clear by a quick look at the data that that's not true, that white people aren't at the top when it comes to gross median income. And so then he says, but if we look more nuanced, it's clear that and the explanation makes no sense. If there was a system being perpetuated by white people to ensure white people remain at the top, how do Asians outperform them on average when it comes to median income?
Well, I never said that it's designed for white people to perform at the top, right? So when we look at whiteness, it's just practices in society that produce white privilege. And then when we look at white privilege, it's just a prioritization of the wants, needs, and desires of white people. Does that mean that those wants, needs, and desires are going to be like seen across an entire group? No, because white privilege, and when we pedal it back to whiteness, these are individual things. These aren't things that are sort of a cast all within an individual group. However, what can happen is you can create policies and practices had the impact of disenfranchising particular groups of people. And something that I'm wondering your thoughts on this, and then I'll let Sound Soul come in, is, so you brought up that Asian Americans are outperforming whites educationally. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
So what would be your statement or sort of challenge to Asian Americans who challenge things like affirmative action and saying that affirmative action is responsible for their poor outcomes when it comes to college admissions and stuff like that? Because you laid out that they're performing well in college. So why would they be challenging a system that seems to be, you know what I'm trying to say? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, sure. So for those that watched my show before we came on, Joe's articulating exactly the point of Ted Lieu. So what Joe's saying is, well, if we look at Harvard admissions and 30% of the people admitted to Harvard are Asian, that proves that they're not being discriminated against. This is despite all empirical evidence.
Don't put words in my mouth. I'm just asking you directly. Like, okay, you laid out that Asian Americans are doing better than whites. So then why are Asian Americans the leaders in challenging affirmative action in the United States? That's my question.
Because they're the people that are disproportionately targeted, particularly by Ivy League schools, the most for their skin color and ethnicity.
But I'm not. So for example, I'm not talking about Ivy League schools here. I'm saying you told me that they're doing they're doing better.
Right. If you let me finish, so it's in academia in general, right? The reason they're against affirmative action is because collegiately, what we see is being Asian is detrimental because Asians do so much better when it comes to SAT scores, when it comes to all of the criteria that colleges used to admit. We see colleges now impeding Asian Americans even more than white Americans with affirmative action policies. So Asian Americans are on the forefront of understanding how affirmative action policies and equity, assuming that we should have an equal percentage of each race represented in every area, they're seeing how that's detrimental to Asian Americans who did everything right. They studied hard. They got the good grades. They got the SAT scores. And yet they're still not admitted into the university they want because it's detrimental based on their race. That's why they're leading the fight.
So let's let Sansol in real quick. He's been waiting real quick. Let's go to Sansol, then Joe, and then Rob.
Yeah. So I just wanted to.
Just raise your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to like point out this is something I noticed that was kind of funny. The idea that things get too nuanced and that's obfuscating some point, because when you get more nuanced and you start explaining things more in more detail, then Rob's argument starts breaking down. We can look at different historical patterns for why Asian Americans might be more advantaged than some white people, than black people, than Hispanics, because when we look at the history of, say, black people in this country, they were brought over on ships and they were slaves, and then they got out of slavery, and then they were promised a bunch of shit that they didn't fucking get. And, like over the course of the next 100 years after slavery ended, they were redlined and all these other things. And, those things really haven't been redressed. Then you look at the history of Asian Americans in this country. Yeah, a lot of people from Asia, specifically China, came over during the days of the Wild West, and they helped us build the railroad. But ever since then, and ever since we opened up our country to immigration in the 60s, the overwhelming majority of people coming from East Asia specifically are people that are already kind of well off, people that are middle class or above, coming to America to have a better life. And so these people are not coming in on boats with nothing, like literally less than fucking nothing, right? This is why we're seeing a massive difference between different ethnic groups in the United States. Not all white people came over here because they were middle class or above. A lot of people that are white came over here. They were poor. They were middle class. They were aristocracy, which is why we see a lot of people all over the place in terms of economic area, right? So I just, that's what I wanted to say. Why do we see a difference between these groups? It's not because of I don't know what you think it is. If it's something genetic, if you think that it's something cultural, whatever you think it is, we can also look at history and patterns throughout history to see why different groups of people in our country, different ethnic groups, different races, are more or less advantaged. And I'll let whoever wants to go next.
Okay, so several things to say here. One, making it more nuanced doesn't disprove my point. It does the exact opposite, right? So the argument is anytime we look at a disparity when it comes to Black Americans, that's explained by white privilege or whiteness, right? So when you could show disparities that actually show that white people aren't on top, you don't then get to say, oh, no, now we need to look at the reasons that white people are on top. We can't look at the reasons that white people might be over certain racial groups, but when certain racial groups are over white people, now we need to look at the reasons. It's not just racism.
But this entire conversation is about
or,
why white people are like, why whiteness is the way it is. Isn't that the point of this conversation?
The point of the conversation is that whiteness, we were quite clear about the definition, which you agreed with Joe's definition that said that these are systems of power that are set to set up and benefit white people. So if we have a system that's dominated by that ideology, how does it make sense that so many groups that aren't white on median income and all these other factors outperform whites? Right. So when we look at a more nuanced look of it, the truth is at the median level, the argument's still true. At the median level, we see Asian Americans outperforming whites. And I haven't looked at Joe's data because he didn't present it. But if he does, and it does show that, well, actually, if you look at highly specific groups like Asian Americans that don't have high school diplomas, they actually are underperforming versus white Americans that do have high school diplomas. Well, the way statistics works is if the average is Asian Americans are $20,000 more than white Americans. If at the bottom level, there's a discrepancy that shows harm in Asians, that proves that at the top level, it benefits Asians even more to bring that average up. That's the way it works. That's why I'm saying looking at a more nuanced look of this still doesn't articulate why Asian Americans are outperforming based on media. And real quick, like perhaps you've never heard of the case of Korematsu, where we intern Japanese Americans. Your explanation of, well, these groups are outperforming because they're all immigrants just isn't true. We can see that
When
people that came here
said
and are
that
like,
most of the no, hold on. When I said a specific like decade for when most people from East Asia came over to this country. Do you remember what that was?
yeah, you said like in the 60s. So, for
Yeah,
example,
the internment camps
do you have
happened
studies
in the 40s.
Okay, so do you have studies that show that most Japanese Americans are immigrants since the 60s?
Wait, what's the
Or
question?
Chinese
What's
Americans?
the question?
What
Do you have evidence that suggests that most Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans came here post 1960?
We have multiple. I guess a better way to approach this.
Do you understand, real quick, and the importance of that question is because
multiple decades that said no Chinese allowed. That was the name of the bill.
The importance of that question is because you're misrepresenting what the data actually says.
No, that's literally what happened.
Real quick, it's not just immigrant. Your explanation is, oh, the reason that these ethnicities are outperforming white people is because they're all immigrants. And to be an immigrant that traveled from a place like the Philippines, you have to have a huge amount of money. So then when you get here, per capita, you're doing.
I didn't say that.
Okay, then what's your
explanation?
That
hold on. Hold on. Let me be clear, because I don't know if you understood my point. Just because you move to America doesn't necessarily mean that you're this ultra wealthy, privileged, perfect person, right? But on average, if you're going to be able to move across an ocean, right, you're going to be, like, in general, you will be, right? It doesn't mean that every single
So I accurately explained your position and you said, no, you're misrepresenting it. This doesn't answer, just real quick, this does not answer why second and third generation and longer than that, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, etc., are still outperforming. If you've been here for 4 or 5 generations.
Okay.
I don't think real quick. So, because Tiberius has been waiting. Okay, go ahead. And then Tiberius, and then we'll go to Joe, and then Rob.
When you're raised in better conditions, you generally have better outcomes. All right, Tiberius, go ahead.
Appreciate it. So there's a part of this conversation that I kind of get, and there's a part where I kind of don't. And I am going to a little bit reiterate what Rob is saying here, because at least if you look at this point blank, we're talking about where I opened up at the start, which is we do see Asian Americans, at least as a income. We're just going to talk income. Like that alone, they do better. Now, if you're going to get into some more nuanced details, Joe, you know this way better than I do. Like I've seen you argue this stuff. At least by the data I have, is that they are generally trending better. Now, there's numerous reasons why, if we wouldn't want to get into that. But to me, that kind of throws the white privilege argument out the window. It needs to be like, all right, cool. Does the systems that be propagate white people more than not? And there's some arguments that actually, I'll even steal man this for you, is that we don't see a lot of differences between Asians and white people regarding criminal convictions. But then if you get Hispanics and African Americans, it goes up to something on the order of 50% longer conviction rates, that kind of thing. So there's definitely disparities in how we treat people and why. The thing here is that I'm not seeing a specifically white person privilege thing, but if I'm going to steel man this conversation into something maybe a little bit more pragmatic, it's almost like a pale skin privilege.
But that makes no sense.
No,
go ahead, Joe. I'm sorry.
It does, because again, when there's so much going on here. The first thing that we had to understand is that the United States had a very conscious effort of making the process of Asian Americans coming into the United States as incredibly selective as possible. And that's a part of the conversation that's incredibly important. They were also allowed to be within particular professions that you could argue that white Americans did not want to participate in. And that's another of this whole historical thing that we get into. But again, when it comes to Asian Americans, it took multiple laws just so that they had equal protections as far as immigration into the United States. Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s was led to its repeal in 1943. Again, we're talking 1982 to 1943. There are people still alive who may have immigrated into the country under the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that's very important to understand. And then we have the Immigration Nationality Act of 1952. And then that had to be replaced again with what we now know as the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1964. And you can't in good faith say that could be one of the reasons why, in part, you see the unequal wealth distribution. There weren't Asian Americans at the seat at the table writing these laws and practices so that they were equal and just, so they wouldn't have these type of impacts that we see today. These were laws and practices predominantly done by white men. And that's important. You can't just ignore that for the sake of not wanting to participate in the nuance of understanding these things. Now, when we look at different types of policies and things that produce white privilege, you can look at certain things like Gritter v. Bollinger. Like my point is, so, and maybe I'll stop from this point and not get too deep and go to v. Bollinger, is that the Supreme Court has had a very important role in preserving or creating whiteness in of itself. As an example of that, you could look at Gritter v. Bollinger, which is a case that found a law school's limitation of affirmative action and its use of race and admissions constitutional. But then it's a little bit more complicated than that, because we only got through Gritter v. Bollinger. There were a bunch of different challenges of affirmative action by white people, right? And the only times that we see challenges of affirmative action and saying that this thing isn't working in the way that I want to see it intended is from white and Asian Americans. And the key challenges to affirmative action and the stripping of things like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and different clauses in those laws were from white Americans. That's important to understand when we're talking about whiteness, right? Because you have a expectation, need, or desire to go somewhere. So you use those things in order for those things to be addressed. So because having the ability to take your case and appeal all the way to the Supreme Court historically, and we could gladly, in like a postlude, talk to a few law students and maybe they can prove me incorrect. Maybe they can help reinforce, however you want to see that. It's predominantly benefited white Americans. You don't see black Americans being able to appeal all the way to the Supreme Court on their cases when they feel like something is unjust in the civil rights, within civil rights or social rights.
Okay, so Joe just proves my entire point with the first part of what he said there was he starts talking about discriminatory laws that affected Asian Americans, talking all the way up into the 50s. A history of this from the 1880s all the way up to the 50s. Absolutely right. Those stuff happened. He leaves out things like Korematsu, but I'm sure he would agree were disgusting, where we interned.
No, that's within there. I said it was repealed in 1943. And then if we want to talk about Korematsu v. U.S., we can go there. That was a year later.
Right, so okay, so anyways, I said I'm sure he would agree with me that was despicable, so I'm not disagreeing with you there. And the point is, and he also says it wasn't white people that, or it wasn't Asian people that wrote the laws repealing that stuff. So. It was white people and things like that. Exactly. So basically, Joe says historically there was a huge amount of discrimination against Asian Americans, and yet they're outperforming white people. And now when we look at disparities when it comes to people of color, it's all
already
there was a very particular group of people who were being prosecuted in the United States, Rob. You can't don't do that, man. Come on now.
Don't do what? You just outlined. You said there is discrimination. It was brutal against Asian Americans. It was brutal against them. And that they never had a seat at the table, that it was white people crafting the laws, and yet Asian Americans are outperforming white people.
Korematsu v.
So how does this jive with the narrative of we have to go back to the 60s and look at redlining, and that's responsible for all of the ills we see? If this is a white supremacist country, and if this is all about whiteness replicating, producing advantages for white people, why did all of a sudden white people lose their grip when they had this constant power that you talked about and allow Asian Americans to surpass
They
them?
never lost the grip, though. Do we see Asian representation in the House of Representatives and Congress?
What does that what does that have to do? If the representative, what does the skin color of the representative matters if the laws that are being passed are benefiting Asian Americans to the point where they're outperforming white Americans by almost $20,000? They're outperforming them in almost every level that we were
regulations. Did Asian
Why
Americans
does it matter?
Those, it matters incredibly, because would you trust women to create reproductive right laws, or would you want men in that conversation?
No, wait. Here's the point. Me as a person, based on my race, based on my gender, my sexual orientation, my religious beliefs, all of that stuff. If 95% of the people in Congress don't match any of that, and yet the laws, let's say we elect a bunch of Muslim lesbian women. 95% of the Congress is Muslim lesbian women in 2022. And if they start making my life so much better that I increase $20,000, my take-home income, my education's better, I won't give a shit that they don't look like me.
Hang on,
They're
Rob.
benefiting.
So
Why?
you're skirting
So
a really
what's that
interesting
matter?
line here. Yes, you can't ignore that symbolic representation matters for a lot of Americans. Like, we got through this cringe fest of Kamala Harris. We're cringing through the pics of Joe Biden's appointments. Like, you can't just ignore that symbolic representation matters for Americans. The problem here is we need substantive representation as well. Like, one thing that you could argue is that white Americans have not only had symbolic representation, but substantive representation as well. So the question then, which you kind of skirt around, albeit very directly, would you trust women, an entire committee designed for women to create laws in terms of reproductive rights? Would you trust women to create laws that were just in such a way that wouldn't have the impact of disenfranchising men?
And real quick, Rob, you'll respond after Rob. We're gonna go to Tiberius, and then whichever Joe Lewis or Sonsol, Rob, and then type.
You might have it right. This is always the problem when we're talking about diversity. The real diversity that matters is the diversity of opinions, the diversity of thoughts. So the real thing that matters is the outcome. What are the policies that you actually make? Yes, you could say that you would expect people that are from different races, genders, etc., to have those differing opinions because they have different backgrounds, but not necessarily. They might all have the same opinion. You could have a room of 10 white people that all disagree and have varying opinions, and a group of 10 people from 10 different races and 10 different genders, whatever, but they all agree. Which one has more diversity? So to answer your question, I'll admit I could be skeptical that all women might not include men's issues when it comes to reproductive rights. However, that's not what we're talking about here, because what we're talking about is you're saying there was a lack of Asian representation, yet we all see the end result. So if we're looking back in the 60s, we might say, geez, there's not enough Asian representation here. Now they're going to issue a bunch of laws that don't benefit Asian people, and Asian people will struggle financially, educationally, etc. But that's not what happened. They're succeeding far greater than whites. So even if you were initially skeptical, I don't know if we see this lack of Asian representation in politics that it will benefit Asian people. Well, it did. They're doing much better.
Question. Do you think that
real quick, because Tiberius has been waiting?
Oh,
Let's go and then Sonsol, yeah, and then you, Sonsol.
I appreciate it. There's parts where Rob's getting at that I do agree with, but the general thing that I want to get here is that as far as substantive and objective, I'm sorry, I'm confusing my words here. I saw what happened when Barack Obama was elected. There was a lot of people in the black community that are very happy that, like, hey, look, we got one of our own in that is president of the United States. First one. Does that matter? Absolutely. Just being there to see people that look like you and that you identify with does matter to people. 100% I'll steal that. And we saw that with Kamala Harris too, with a bunch of young women being the VP spot. So does that matter? Sure. The question is, like, do we need, like, what kind of representation are we going to find acceptable? Last time I checked, Asians are 3% of the population. Are they going to be 3% of Congress? Do we need more? Do we need less? This conversation gets a little weird for me personally. But I'll give you another argument here that is Congress largely filled with old white dudes? Yeah, sure. Does that mean that they're going to represent everyone effectively? Probably not. So I can even steel man that. The problem that I have here, and just recircling back to the disconnect, is that there are people who do not identify as white that do as well as white people, if not better, and there are people who do not. And this is where I just completely fall apart in this conversation, is that even steel manning this is that there's levels where this breaks down. And that is, if you look at third generation Hispanic immigrants that are, second generation citizens, they're on parity with white people. Most of the Hispanic population, at least by the data that I have, is most of them are first and second generation immigrants that are coming in here from Central America that have nothing to build up to them, they have nothing when they get here, and their highest aspiration is to work at a sub-11 and put their kids through school. So yeah, I can totally see where they're at $51,000 a year if I last I checked. There's level here where I can totally make arguments to say that, yeah, are white people doing pretty well? Yeah. On a general level, yeah, sure. They have some of the easiest access to education and wealth and all that, sure. What I don't get here is that people who just that are not category guys, just white, can absolutely outperform them in an overall metric sense, this conversation just dies for me. It really does. So I need you to sell me on this, Joe, because that's where I'm just lost.
Yeah, I feel that. I can try a little bit.
Let's go to Santo real
Yeah,
quick
but
because he had his
Santo.
hand up, and then we'll go to Joe, and then you, Joe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have like a quick question. I'm very interested to see what Rob says here. So I'll ask you one question and then I'll explain why I'm asking it. Do you think that something has to disadvantage others always to advantage a group? If a group is in charge, does any policy that they do to make themselves still in charge have to disadvantage others?
I would say that if a group is in charge and is interested in propagating their superiority, then evidence that other groups are outperforming them would prove that they're not doing a good job of propping up their superiority.
Okay, so if a group is already the hegemonic power in a country and they do something to enrich themselves, and it just so happens to have a tangential impact elsewhere, that's not advantaging themselves. It does help other people, right? Although that's not the intended impact of the bill. Is that still not enriching themselves?
Well, that's under what way have they enriched themselves? Because if we look at almost every ethnicity, we could see that people have become wealthier as time has gone on.
All right, cool.
So
yeah,
you would say the same. So the problem is this: the reason that this is an issue, it's not an issue of the white people. Just real quick, it's not an issue of white people have got more money per capita. It's an issue of, are they being advantaged at the cost of other races? And is that because they're white, then people in positions of leadership are doing that? That only makes sense if white people are outperforming all non-white people, but they're not.
No, no. Okay, so the reason I bring this up, bringing it back to the Hofstadter Act, is that the immigration bill from the 60s that is controversial? So the reason that I bring this up is, am I remembering the name of that wrong?
There's
so
many.
Yeah. So this bill was really controversial because before this, the demographics of the United States was 90% white or something like that, something like crazy, super high. Everyone in the U.S. was fucking white. All right. After this, the demographics started to change to where at this point, after implementing this Immigration Act, we're starting to see that white people are going to be the minority later on. That was an unintended effect of this bill. They did not know that was going to happen. What they did this bill for was because they needed more labor in the country. They needed to have more immigration. The economic race to the top was being impeded by our lack of citizens. So we opened up our country to immigration, and we had provisions in there that families can bring their families over, et cetera, which is some things that a lot of people are trying to get rid of now. So the tangential effect of this was that people that were coming from other countries, generally speaking, had the money to come over here. That's why I was bringing up the Asian Americans generally having more money than African Americans, because when they came over, they weren't brought over on ships. They were brought over of their own accord, right? And they had the money to do it. And this was still keeping white people relatively wealthy, because at that time in the country, most of the people that owned businesses were white people. They were the ones that were importing labor, that were needing labor from other countries. That's why I ask you this question, because this still did, by and large, help white people, right? It had the unintended effect of, or not even unintended, it had a tangential effect of creating a non-white majority like 80 years down the line. But it also had the unintentional effect of most of the people that came over were people that could afford to, right?
It's Joe. Joe wanted to go, so I'll.
No, yeah, I mean,
I can respond if you want.
You can respond. Go for it, man.
Okay. It's totally complete. So now here's what we have to believe. Again, your side is the side arguing that we need to reject whiteness, and we'll get to the harms of rejecting whiteness. We're just right now talking about, does this exist and how you define it, that we have a system propped up by white people to ensure white people stay on top. You lose the plot right out of the gate, as Tiberius is saying. He's not sold on it, and he's more generous to your argument than me. I'm just going to call it flat out racism, not from you two necessarily, but that's the way it's employed. But he's not sold because white people aren't on top. If your argument starts off with, we have a system institutionally set up to make sure white people stay on top, and you can't even prove white people are on top, maybe your argument's falling flat. Now the arguments become things like, well,
It's not making them go down to the ground, is it?
White
It's not
people
disadvantaging them at any level, is it?
Of course it is. It depends on where you're at. This is the problem with just breaking it on disparities and just looking at race. For example, if you look at suicide rates, white males are by far the most prominent group committing suicide. So when it comes to people that think this,
that's not necessarily true.
You can't just bring up
It's men and women.
without explaining why that is,
Hold on,
because that doesn't make any sense.
Go on, Sanso. Go ahead.
White people are also the most likely people to go to fucking country music bars, all right? But that doesn't mean that they're like more or less advantaged, all right? Just because like you have to explain why a thing happens, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're
so you're
more
talking
disadvantaged
about
in one
how,
way or another.
Okay, so you're talking about how this system has privileged white people, and then when I give a clear-cut example of something that's not a privilege of people
I can
killing
think of
themselves,
5 or 6 reasons off the top of my head why someone might be more suicidal even though they're more successful.
Okay, sure, go for it. Why is it traditionally poor white people then?
Is it traditionally more? Okay, so if you're more successful in life, right? If you're working long fucking hours and you never have any time to go around and fucking hang out with your friends or hang out with your family, more likely to fucking kill yourself.
Boy, that sounds like privilege.
If you got
let's hear about that privilege.
Wait, but
you're working 80 hours a week.
If you got a job over someone else, if you got 80 hours a week and you're working, like I've already said at the very beginning of this, that there are poor people in Appalachia, there are poor people all over the country that are white people, right? But that I also, by that same thing, I said that just because you don't have an advantage in wealth doesn't mean that you don't have an advantage in like your whiteness, right? There's different things that give you more or less advantage in this life, right? So just because on average white people have more advantages in this country, right, than black people doesn't mean that I am more or less or that I'm more advantaged than fucking Michael Jordan, because Michael Jordan has fucking Air Jordans. He was a fucking I don't know basketball position, but he was in the fucking NBA for a long goddamn time and he made a lot of fucking money there. He was in fucking Looney Tunes, the fucking Space Jam. He made a lot of money off of that, right? So he's probably more privileged than me in that respect, right? But if there was a call out on the police scanner and me and Michael Jordan were walking around at night and they said that there's like a sketchy dude walking around, he's more likely to get shot by the police than me because I'm a white dude. There's different ways that we're advantaged. He gets to like do whatever the fuck he wants because he's super rich. I probably am not going to be shot by cops because someone put out a call that there's a sketchy dude walking around.
So just a heads up, we're gonna keep going. Rob, I'll let you respond, and then we'll go to Joe. But just real quick, I asked, sure, we'll go Joe, and then whoever wants to go. But I just asked the audience. I put a poll if we want to keep going with whiteness or switch the topic, and majority rules. So we're gonna switch the topic, but later on, a little bit later, we're gonna keep going for a bit, okay? But yeah, that's what the audience wants. So we're gonna go with them. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one part of this that I'm curious about is exactly what do we mean when the idea of on top is thrown around, because I was thrown around a lot, so I'm just trying to just make sure it's very centered. So like what do we mean on top? The argument that I think Rob said, I might be misrepresenting this, but I want to make sure it's as clear as possible, that you mentioned something on the lines of that white people aren't on top. What exactly does that mean, and what does on top mean for you?
So traditionally, when we look at things like happiness indexes, when we look at things that we consider to be success measures, such as median income, education levels, lack of incarceration, and things like that, in all of those areas, we can see that Asian people disproportionately outperform whites. That's
okay. Do you think that Asian Americans are in the lowest in terms of incarceration because of their proclivity to crime?
No, I'm not making a genetic argument. If you want to make a genetic argument, that's
no.
fine.
I'm saying like why do you think that exists? Do Asian Americans just commit less crimes?
So again, here's the funny thing. As soon as we start talking about crime numbers, because we could talk about that if you want, you'll say that's because of white supremacy. That's why, because white supremacy set up a system, and so we can't actually look at the reasons behind that there might be disproportional incarceration rates. Real quick, if black people are incarcerated at higher numbers than white people, that proves racism. So if I say, okay, but white people are incarcerated at higher numbers than Asian Americans, does that prove racism against white Americans? You'll say, well, wait a minute. We need to look at what the potential reasons for that are. That's exactly right. We should look at those potential reasons. And we should also be looking at those potential reasons when it comes to black incarceration numbers. It seems that the people that want to reject whiteness only want to look at disparities and say it proves racism when it benefits their political argument. When it's a different race and it shows that white people actually aren't at the top level of these, like right now we're talking about the law enforcement industry. When it turns out that white people are incarcerated at far higher rates than Asian Americans, now all of a sudden it's, well, that disparity doesn't prove racism. There could be a bunch of reasons behind that. That's exactly what my point is. So you asking me what are the potential reasons? Agreed. We could talk about the potential reasons.
So
I would love to have that conversation when it comes to African Americans as well.
I'm not trying to
do it.
Look, I want to make something very clear to you, Rob. I'm not one of these leftists on Twitter that's going to shout white supremacy every time they say something. I'm not going to be one of these white liberals that's going to label everybody as a Nazi. If you look through my Twitter, and you can do that right now if you would like, I never, ever in my history of my Twitter account ever labeled anybody a Nazi, nor even said that they had any sort of type of white supremacist. I very rarely use the term white supremacy because I want to make sure I identify the enemy as clearly as possible. So when I ask you, in good faith, why you think Asian Americans aren't incarcerated at the same rates as other members who have low representation in society, I'm asking that question in good faith. Because when we look at the representation of people who are in lower demographics, such as Latin Americans, Hispanic Americans, Black Americans, and Asian Americans, you'll notice that their incarceration rates for Asian Americans is incredibly low. But then for Black Americans, it skyrockets in a place where per capita, it makes absolutely no sense statistically. So I'm asking you, why do you think that phenomenon exists where Asian Americans are incarcerated at such a low rate compared to other ethnic minorities and racial minorities in the United States?
Culture, two-parent households.
What do those two things have to do with incarceration rates?
If you have parents and you have a culture that encourages people not to commit violent crimes and instead study hard and succeed through the education system, you're far less likely to wound up in the justice system.
Are you saying that Black people don't have that kind of culture that facilitates those things that you described, or Latino Americans?
Yes.
Why? Why do you think that is?
Well, one, we could see the numbers that I think it was a Democrat in the 60s named Patrick Moynihan put together a report that said it was a national travesty that 25% of blacks were born out of wedlock and living in single parent household. That number is over 75% now. So we can see the raw data suggests that there's something there culturally that we could see that there's this crisis of single parent households.
Sure. So
secondly, we could see.
Secondly, let me hold on. I want to get you on the Moynihan because I'm very, as Tiberius knows, I'm in deep relationship with the Moynihan report. So also within the Moynihan report, it showed that as Black unemployment went down, welfare claims for Black Americans went up. Why do you think that happened?
As so again, Black unemployment rate, so more Black people. So you're saying
unemployment rate went down, and the welfare claims among Black Americans went up. And across the point,
we issued the war on poverty. That's why.
What's that?
Because we issued the war on poverty.
So hold on. This is before the war on poverty. The Moynihan report was an analysis of the conditions of 62, ghettos.
Right?
What's that?
62, right?
Around that time, yes. The thing that will make incredibly clear here is that I'm laying out to you that the unemployment rate dropped for Black Americans, and then all of a sudden their welfare claims started going up. So why is it that when we saw unemployment going down, we saw welfare claims going up?
I would say because people were learning about access to those programs and were taking advantage of those programs more.
Why would they need access to those programs if the unemployment rates were going down?
Because they still, despite the employment that they had, they felt they met the criteria for collecting that welfare.
The Moynihan report didn't lay that out as one of the arguments.
Okay, so then what's your answer?
One of the arguments that they laid out was the underemployment. So although Black Americans were being employed, the employment stats and the employment characteristics that we describe in the United States were incredibly flawed. So one thing that Moynihan said after he talked about the report is that maybe within the very report that he laid out, that there might have been discrepancies in not properly analyzing the underemployment problem in the United States. However, something that Patrick Moynihan supported was reparations. He said, and I'm quoting here.
Yeah, it's a disaster. It's racism.
Well, this is Patrick Moynihan, the very person that you cited, who argued that all Black slaves are deserved of their back wages. And he said that on Meet the Press. And he also argued that one of the most...
I agree with that.
And one of the things that he argued...
Black slave their money. I agree.
Right. He was in support of reparations. And even in the multiple discussions, when he was asked to clarify, he said, are you talking about the special treatment for Negroes? And then he said that America, paraphrasing here, used to make a special effort Do you think that we as Americans, as a country, made a special effort to improve the economic conditions of Black Americans?
No, I think focusing on race is a disaster. As we can see, when I'm talking about Moynihan, I'm just looking at the raw data. I don't really give a shit what his opinions are and how to solve that. We saw what the Democrats' opinions were on how to solve that.
You can't diminish the impact of Patrick Moynihan, where this was his job, and then just say you can't talk about race.
What I'm saying. If I say Fox News says the unemployment rate's 7%, I don't then have to say, oh, and Fox says the way to make that better is X. I'm just talking about what the rate was. We had the Democrats issue the war on poverty. That number went from basically 1/4 of Black children being in single parent homes to now 3 out of 4. You asked me to explain why there are bigger incarceration rates. That's my explanation. Now, let's hear your explanation. Why is it that Asian Americans are doing so much better when it comes to incarceration rates compared to white Americans, but Black Americans are doing so much worse when it comes to white Americans? What's your reason?
Unfortunately, we never really get to understanding those reasonings, because every single time that there's any type of analysis in terms of the Asian American experience in the United States, Congress is incredibly fidgety when it comes to analyzing those problems. So, as an example, right, with the Moynihan report, another report that came from the Johnson administration. But again, just because I'm bringing up efforts in the Johnson administration was a devout failure. And even if I were to rank Lyndon B. Johnson in the presidents of the United States, he's in my bottom 5%. So I'll make that incredibly clear here. However, something that he did that was very good were the creation of commissions to create different recommendations that were supposed to benefit all the problems that they were dealing with in the 60s, specifically his deliberate war on poverty, and also the analysis of the hot summer, so to speak, of the 60s and 70s. One of the problems when we're talking about Asian Americans is the very problem that Congress never ever wants to tackle, the analysis of the conditions of Asian Americans, because there are a lot of questions there. Why do Asian Americans underrepresent when it comes to polling across the United States? Why do Asian Americans don't go into different fields that might benefit them, like say farming or agriculture or even things like education? When I'm talking about education, I'm specifically talking about public education. These are all the questions one of many questions I have about Asian Americans. But anytime we get to a point where we should analyze the conditions of Asian Americans, it gets skirted and avoided in such a way that doesn't let us even have an analysis of the problem. The reason why we can have an understanding about the condition of Black Americans is because there were commissions and committees designed to understanding these problems. As we saw with the Kerner report, and a lot of the things that we see in terms of Black Lives Matter are basically ripped from the Kerner report, not even trying to show that they're plagiarizing, is that America hasn't really addressed any of the issues that even the reports are trying to lay out, which is a problem, and I'll admit to that. And now what happens is
sure they have, and again, that was just a big non-answer of saying if the argument is that whiteness,
my answer to be clear, I'll answer it directly. Let me answer it directly. I don't know, because the analysis currently is not fleshed out in a way that we can have a clear consensus.
If the explanation that is given from the Black Lives Matter critical race theory crowd was right, that we need to reject whiteness because whiteness is propping up a system to benefit white people, and that's why, because of this criminality and the things like that, or not criminality, but because of the laws that they set up, that's why blacks are incarcerated more, we would expect Asian Americans to also fall into that gap. So the fact that you're admitting that they don't.
No, for a while,
why do you think?
Hang
on, Sansel. Why do you think Black Americans and women are so dedicated to making sure that there are Black Americans and women in their juries? Why do you think that is?
So Rob, we'll go to Rob, and then Ty, and then we'll go back to either Joe Lewis or Sansel.
Okay, so like we're not going to be debating this all night, so I'll answer this question and just throw some other facts out there because that are worth talking about. Because as always, we get to the real harms of, or we ignore the real harms of this whiteness and how it's racist against people. So I'll say this: I would assume that people want people on juries that are sympathetic to them. For example, most studies show that Black Americans have harsher feelings to white Americans when it comes to juries than white Americans have towards Black Americans. So I wouldn't be surprised then if that data is true that Black Americans want people that look like them to be on those juries. They probably, if you're a Black victim of a white crime, you probably also want Black people to be on that jury. If you're a white victim of a Black crime, you probably also want white people to be on that jury.
Do you think,
I don't
so
think that's unique to Black people, right?
So if I can get some other points, it's funny. Yeah, but I want to answer this directly here.
Bring up women, though.
You're not engaging. You're not engaging.
You bring up women, though.
You're not engaging, and you're not engaging in my question.
Women, though. So here's.
You're not engaging in my question.
Your question is, why would black people want black people on a jury? Why would white people want white people on a jury?
No,
why would Asian people want Asian people on a jury?
Why is it that so often we see black Americans complain about the lack of black Americans on their juries?
Maybe there's not enough black jurors.
Well, you would think that to be the case.
Now,
hang on. The Supreme Court just ruled.
The
Supreme Court just ruled in Foster v. Chapman in 2016 that the very thing, pejorative strikes, are unconstitutional. I'm paraphrasing here because basically there's a lot going on in nuance there. They ruled that if minorities are disproportionately excluded from a jury panel, the prosecution has to justify their preemptive strikes with non-racial explanations. So why is it that we have a Supreme Court decision almost 30 years after a jury that that pejorative strikes are having these racialized outcomes? Why does that exist?
I'm unfamiliar with the case. It's irrelevant to the conversation at hand. Now, you're talking about women. You talk about women and things like that. Why is it that men are 6 times the disproportion between men and women in the criminal justice system is 6 times worse than the disproportion between blacks and whites? Do we live in a misandrist community?
Foster's jury was all white. And it showed.
What does that have anything to do with the data that I just said?
Because through the pejorative strikes, black Americans were disproportionately excluded from his jury.
What does that have to do with the data I just said? Years. If that's true, how is that relevant? That's like me saying, but the Statue of Liberty says bring your poor. Okay, it has nothing to do. Let me repeat the question. Let me repeat the question. If you're saying the disparity in incarceration rates and all of that stuff between blacks and whites proves racism, why is there a 6 times more disparity between men and women than there are between blacks and whites? Does that prove we live in a sexist system?
I'm not going to let you run from this jury question.
Right. There we go.
I'm not going to let you run from this jury question.
What's your question about the jury? So your question about the jury thing is this. How come a Supreme Court said we shouldn't strike black jurors? I don't know. It sounds shitty. They shouldn't strike black jurors. Okay, why is the disparity between what? Go ahead, ask your question again. We'll do this all night.
Why are non-white Americans being disproportionately struck by pre-preparatory strikes? So much so that we led to Foster v. Chapman in 2016. If juries were just, why do we need to appeal to the Supreme Court in that way?
I don't have the study in front of me, but here's some ideas I could come off the top of my head. One, who's striking the juries? The defendants? Yes.
Answer the question directly. Just answer the question directly.
You know the data. Who's striking these jurors? Defendants?
Just answer the question directly, Rob.
That is part of the answer to the question.
You can answer the question without me getting any more. I cannot make it any more clear than I can for you right now.
So then I'll answer
Running Rob.
So, okay, real quick, because we're going. Hold on. Real quick.
I insist I'll answer the question. I insist I'll answer the question.
I understand. Hold on, Rob. Real quick, Rob. I understand. I'm going to throw it back to you.
Sorry, my dog's running in.
Oh, Rob, I'm going to throw it back to you. I just want to let you know after Rob, then Tiberius, because he's been waiting. So go ahead, Rob, and then Time.
The reason is because black defendants don't want black people on the jury because they disproportionately kill black people and harm black people. That's the reason.
Time, and we'll go to Joe.
So it's actually racist against black victims. Black homicide perpetrators don't want black jurors because they know the victims were black. That's why. Right, Joe? Correct?
I don't even know how to engage with that.
Why are you running from this? That's clearly the reason. Why are you running?
Because Rob, I'm trying to. So if the reason why I can let me engage with this then, right? So when we talk about whiteness, one of the expectations that you have, right, is that if you are charged of a crime that makes it to court, you want to look at your jury and make it seem like it's representative of your peers. Historically, that has not been the case for Black Americans, Asian Americans, and women especially. So one of the things the prosecutors want to make incredibly clear is that they have representation that represents their peers. A Black American having an all-white jury for a murder trial is not a representative of their peers. Would you agree with that?
Right.
No, don't write me. Don't. If you disagree with it, engage.
You're steering the conversation in a direction that has nothing to do with anything. Yes,
I'm directly giving you an example of whiteness in the criminal justice system.
You want black jurors. When I asked you specifics about this, you refused to answer and smugly said just answer. When I'm telling you that I don't have access to the study, to the data, to the court case you're making. So I'm asking relevant questions like, who struck these jurors? Was it the defense that struck the jurors? Was it the prosecution? Was it the judge that struck? There are tons of reasons that disproportionately black jurors could be struck. Maybe it's because black jurors don't want to be on the jury more than white jurors. So when they're answering the questions about whether or not they should be on the jury, they give reasons that suggest they don't want to be there. Maybe it's because they're less likely to fill out their selective service cards, which means they're less likely to get the call for jury duty. Maybe there could be a ton of reasons. Once more, this is an example of you obfuscating the conversation by saying, well, there's a disparity, therefore it proves racism.
No, it's not a disparity, Rob. Like, again, I'm not the enemy that you think I am here. I'm trying to give you an example of whiteness and how it perpetuates itself in the criminal justice system. I'm laying out to you as clear as I possibly can.
I asked a question that you ignored. Then why can you explain that the difference between men and women's treatment is 6 times worse for men in the criminal justice system than the difference between blacks and whites?
Hold on.
Do we live in a sexist society?
Repeat that one more time a little bit slower.
So there's a difference. There's a disparity between blacks and whites treatment in the criminal justice system.
You said something about men and women. I didn't catch that part.
Right.
You cut out.
Yeah, so you understand that. There's
no. I didn't understand what you said because you cut out for me, which is why I'm asking you to repeat it a little bit slower.
There's a disparity between blacks and whites, but the disparity between men versus women is 6 times worse than the disparity between blacks and whites.
What type of disparity are you describing here?
Such as length of sentence, likelihood to be stopped, likelihood to be charged, likelihood to be incarcerated. 6 times worse for men compared to women than blacks compared to whites.
What are men being charged for?
All sorts of crimes. They're more likely to be charged at all sorts of crimes. Even for the types of crimes, the difference between the treatment that men get, for example, homicide. Men's sentences on homicide are far lengthier on average, about 6 times lengthier on average to women compared to blacks to whites.
So real quick, let me jump to Tiberius because he rose his hand a long time ago. I just want to throw it back to him.
The original point I was going to throw out there, I think, is either derailed or I might have lost it somewhere in the nebulous in my mind. But if I can actually, or if I can get Joe a moment of his time to like just one-on-one with me, because as much as I enjoy this exchange, I need you to sell me on this, Joe, because Rob said it. I'm the sympathetic one, so I'm trying to understand this. And literally, dude, I will steel man this for you. Right? Is that like I'll give you the pale argument that I made earlier. It's like people that kind of like can pass as white or just as generally pale skin. I can totally roll with that because we can see that even with great example. I was talking about earlier with Hispanics that come over here, they're very fairly oriented, has a lot of what conservatives would argue as pillars that generate stability long term, such as the nuclear family, that kind of thing, is that they're still more likely to be stopped, they're still more likely to be incarcerated, and after that, they're likely to receive a longer sentence, particularly the black community, which I've said, probably has poverty to do with that too. Rob talked about fatherlessness. So the thing I need to you is this a white problem thing? Is this a pale person thing? Or is it literally, the argument I'm just going to try to sell to you is that this isn't a problem with race, is a problem of poverty, and because of the history of this country where we screwed over black people primarily, and we still have young Hispanic people coming in that are economically disadvantaged compared to natural born citizens, it's that there's a ceiling there, and it's harder than shit to punch through. And I'll totally give you that. Yeah, there's levels here where it doesn't make it any easier. Right, like I'm trying to steelman the crap out of this, man, but you got to sell me on that last point.
So, like the big thing to understand, which makes this really tricky in the United States, is that the laws if we go all the way back, right? If we go all the way back,
right,
1619 or 1776, depending on where
we can go to 93. We can talk about the crime bill, right? Like it disproportionately put away black fathers from their families because of stupid ass marijuana charges and all that. So like I can go even in my lifetime.
Yeah.
So tell me
too, right? Is that there's PROA within that same administration that gets totally sort of, I don't want to say skirted under the rug. I'm aware of the concerns of PROA. I'm talking about the Personal Responsibility and Work Accountability Act, which was in the same thing in the Clinton administration, where basically what you saw is that poverty didn't necessarily become a state of being that the government should handle. It became essentially a crime, right? So what that looks like is different things would punish you within the system. One example of that, right, is that
Being arrested for being homeless.
yeah, like arrested for being homeless. The idea that like even if you are homeless, that could be like a negative strike on your credit score. Lack of income, so like gaps of income are considered to be very unpopular on resumes, despite the fact for people who are childbearing, right? Like there's a reason why people take gaps in their employment for taking care of their children. Like that's a very clear thing. But what we see, right, is when we talk about the idea of white privilege and really the idea of whiteness, is that there are needs, expectations, and desires to be had. Like if you are somebody who is pregnant, you want to feel like, okay, after I take care of my child to a point where I think I can take them to daycare or something like that. Black Americans don't have the equal access to things like childcare. So they're able to like have the desire of, I want to make sure my child is taken care of so I can get back into the workforce. That wasn't a benefit for Black Americans. That predominantly was a benefit for white Americans, specifically white women. I have the desire to make sure that my child is put into the condition where they are educationally successful. That is a benefit predominantly, again, generally speaking here, right? We can, if we look down from all white Americans, you'll see that like every individual case is different, but across the entire spectrum, this is a benefit that benefits white Americans, not so much for Black Americans. Interject? Yeah, sure.
Sure. So again, this is how these debates always go. It's just we're going to ignore what the topic was rejecting whiteness. I'm more than happy to engage in supposedly everything is white privilege, and then we need to reject white privilege. You still haven't answered by your own definition the fact that. Well, yeah, I silently. So sure, again, I'm going to talk for 6 minutes like you just did. So so we see that you can't even prove your initial definition that says whites are on top. That this is a system that keeps whites on top. That system has clearly failed. Then. And then saying all of this is a result of white privilege instead of interrogating the reasons that maybe Black people are poor and other things like that.
I never said it was an example of white privilege.
That's great. So
I never said it was an example of white
let's
privilege.
talk about some of the things that and every conversation like this is dominated both at the large group by people with actual voices in the mainstream media and stuff, and on these panels, it's constantly dominated by there was a bunch of bad shit that happened in the past. So let's get around to rejecting whiteness. Something that
well, let me continue.
Joe said, and it's something that Joe said.
So something that Joe said at the beginning, that this doesn't necessarily mean white people, that this isn't bad. So let's hear some of the things that our government alone is doing when it comes to rejecting whiteness. Examples are instructive. A series of events at the Treasury Department, Federal Finance Agency, diversity trainer Howard Russ taught people that America was built in the backs of people that were enslaved, and all white Americans are complicit in the system of white supremacy by automatic response in the ways that we're taught. In accompanying documents, Ross argues that whites share an inborn oppressive streak. Whiteness, employees are told, includes white privilege and white supremacy. Consequently, whites who struggle to own their racism, he instructs managers to have listening sessions which black employees can speak about their experience and see their pain, while white employees are instructed to sit in discomfort. At the Sandia National Laboratories, which develops technology for America's nuclear arsenal, executives held a racially segregated training session for white male employees. The 3-day event, which was led by a company called White Men as Full Diversity Partners, set the goal of examining white male culture and making the employees take responsibility for their white privilege, male privilege, and heterosexual privilege. In one of the opening exercises, the instructors wrote on a whiteboard that white male culture could be associated with white supremacists, KKK, Aryan Nation, and MAGA hats. At the Department of Homeland Security, diversity trainers had a session on microaggressions based on the work of psychologist Darrell Sue. In his academic work, Sue argues that white Americans have been fed a racial curriculum based on falsehood, unwarranted fears, and the belief in their own superiority, and thus have been socialized into oppressive roles. I could go on and on and on, and that's just with government agencies. We can see how this is rampant in academia, and we're teaching people to hate people based on their skin color. Now, all of this is based, in order for this to be anywhere remotely justified, everything that you said previously had to be true. It's not true, and we can have that debate anytime you want. So but even if it was true, how is this beneficial in rejecting whiteness that we're particularly targeting white people in this way?
So when we talk about rejecting whiteness, there's nowhere in the conversation where people are looking for white Americans to be at the bottom of any type of social class. What we're looking for, right, is that the expectations, needs, and desires of all Americans are met in such a way that makes sense in reality, right? So for Tiberius and I, we both, if we had, again, my girlfriend is watching. Hi, she's trying to indoctrinate me to have children. She gave me a 3-year clock, and now she says she said that a year ago, so I don't know if it's a 2-year clock. But anyway, I'm not saying that I'm gonna knock on my girlfriend here. Really, she'd be really excited on that. With that being said, both Tiberius and I want to make sure that our imaginary son has the same type of economic benefits that are really educational benefits, right? We both have that expectation for our child. Now, it's shown, right, that for Black Americans, we don't really see the same type of educational benefits that white Americans receive. So that's an example of whiteness.
That's not
right?
bad. Again, we're back to this. You're taking this right back to where we are.
No.
You're saying
Because
there's a disparity,
again,
therefore it proves racism. I just gave you specific examples. With all due respect, we talked about that for over an hour. I just gave you specific examples of our federal government having institutions that are directly disparaging white people in very specific ways. Do you have any comment on that?
No, I don't have a comment on that because I want to really make sure we're incredibly clear what we're talking about when we say rejecting whiteness. Rejecting whiteness would be rejecting white privilege. So what that does is, instead of creating this system or creating systems that have the impact of prioritizing the wants, needs, and desires of white people, we create something that we don't have these practices in the first place to create the thing at all. Right. So
do you have anything to say about those specific examples? You could say, when I say reject whiteness, I mean this way. That's clearly not the way that these people at federal institutions were applying it. And I could come up with a dozen more examples if you want.
So we're incredibly clear, when I say reject whiteness, I'm saying rejecting the practices in society that produce white privilege. Right. So one of the things that lead to white privilege, which I defined very early in the conversation as a mode of social hierarchy that prioritizes the wants, needs, and desires of white people, is creating.
But they don't. Asian Americans are better. We had that discussion.
No,
for
we
an
didn't.
hour.
We didn't.
Now
Really
we're talking about the specific ways.
We didn't really lay out in the
All right,
conversation.
guys, all right.
We didn't lay out in the conversation that Asian Americans were better.
So it looks like we've gotten to the conversation where I think we're gonna go back to what we've already said before. So let's just close out the conversation. I thought it was a really, really good conversation in my opinion on both sides, honestly. So let's do closing statements, 2 minutes each. We'll, as the guests on the show, we're gonna let the lefties have the final word. So Rob, why don't you go ahead and give your closing statements? 2 minutes.
Everyone who watched my pre-show saw exactly how this would go. It's the exact same thing every time. Historical oppression, historical oppression, historical oppression. I refuse to acknowledge the ways that whiteness is happening now. We got to 3 minutes of it, and then we end the topic, and Joe still couldn't answer for it, just like they never can. They're all for it. We've talked about all sorts of evil things that come along with the racist ideology of rejecting whiteness. He seeks to win this argument somehow that, oh, no, all these things that happen is because of white privilege and whiteness, and that's what keeps white people on top, and he's factually wrong. White people are on top in almost all the measures we use. And so that's where he wants to take the debate. That's constantly what happened. We'll rail on and on about court decisions, about jury selections and stuff like that. If I was to stand up here and say reject blackness because blackness leads to more homicides and black people are 47 times more likely to commit a violent crime against a white person than vice versa, therefore we need to reject blackness, Joe would be jumping all over me talking about how racist that was. But he doesn't have anything to say when our federal government is treating white people like shit in the manners in which I said, and I have dozens more of examples. He doesn't want to talk about how people use reject whiteness to mean things different than what he's claiming that it means because he can't defend these actions. And we can see how this leads to horrible things that are occurring. He wants to, like everything else, just like I said at the beginning of this, people that argue this, they want to say that white supremacy or, in his words, white privilege are responsible for all the ills and we can't interrogate the reasons those things happen. He just looks at these disparities and says, oh, see, this is all proof of white privilege, but then he totally ignores when we see other groups that aren't white outperforming whites. It's a joke. It's an excuse for racism. I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about more of what rejecting whiteness actually looks like, but I'm not surprised because that's the way these conversations always go, as I predicted before we started.
All right, Tiberius, go ahead, brother. 2 minutes.
All right, appreciate it. I'm having trouble a little organizing my thoughts here, so I might be a little scatterbrained. When I look at this conversation, I've tried to steel man it to even where the point I'm like, hey, look, I think there's some legitimacy in saying, people of a fairer complexion are treated better. I literally went down the conviction rate, that kind of thing. It seems to be as the darker the skin gets, the worse it gets. So, if we're going to talk about that on a general level, I can steel man that and say, look, we have a race problem here in the country. People are not being treated right. And that just goes down to every story that I hear from almost every black man that I come in contact with, where he tells me I can't walk into an elevator without a woman clutching her purse. I hear that. I understand that. That is a problem. However, what I generally look at as far as a more macro trend here is that what I find more in commonality is not that race is the primary factor here. It's poverty. It's harder to get rich when you're poor. And unfortunately, because of numerous economic factors, which I have strongly advocated on and against, is that we're not only seeing black people and Hispanic people not be able to advance up in ways that they used to be able to before, if at all. But now white people are actually starting to see a collapse in their own societies, where we're seeing every socioeconomic trend that it indicates bad things is now happening to them. So my assertion is this. Do I think we have racial problems in this country? Yes. Do I think that those need to have a conversation on? Yes, which I'm glad to be here on. However, I do not see a massive pejoratization of just white people good and we must keep them on top, as much as it is rich people control this bitch, and they're the ones that are going to keep it in charge. Now, is more rich people white than everyone? Yeah, I'll give you that. But does that mean that it's just for white people only? I reject this notion. I'm sorry.
All right, Mr. Sonsol, go ahead, sir. 2 minutes.
Yeah. So actually, I like some of the things that Tiberius said there. I think there was a lot of stuff that we could have gone down and tried to hash out. I think that would have been a more productive conversation. One of the things that really irritates me when we have these conversations is causation versus correlation. When we look at the things that you at a very surface level say are the causes of something, say a single parent family, or like living in poverty, or like anything like that, going one level deeper and saying why is that, and then we get told that we're looking too nuanced at things and that these things are irrelevant to what we're talking about. We have to look very surface level at it. That's the thing that really irritates me. Now I think that some of the stuff that Rob brought up there with the rules, whatever, with the government. Yeah, I can accept that those things are very cringe, and a lot of the way that people use whiteness and white privilege are a very academic term that, on a surface level, don't really make a lot of sense. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm a white person originally. When people were like, you have white privilege," I was like, I'm poor. I am in debt because of college, right? But yeah, it's something that you have to actually want to learn about and actually look into for more than like 2 seconds with bias to show that actually I'm the one in trouble. So yeah, that's about all I have to say about that. Are we going to COVID next, or? Okay.
Yes, sir. All right. So last but not least, Mr. Joe Lewis, go ahead, sir. 2 minutes.
Yeah, so again, when we talk about whiteness and the way that I explain it to people so they understand what I'm talking about is just the practices that produce white privilege. And if you get rid of the practices that produce white privilege, then you don't have to really worry about white privilege at all. Right. And the problem here is that when we talk about whiteness is that anybody can participate in whiteness regardless of their skin tone. Right. This is why we have a situation where justice for Breonna Taylor, but then you have to go to Mayor Lightfoot for that. Like there's a very clear like line in the road that's like, OK, something else is going on here that has nothing to do with the color of the skin of the people in power. With that being said, one thing that's incredibly unfortunate is that these conversations tend to need a lot more time than the time allotted. So what happens is it gets to be like this back and forth of jabbing at points and saying, well, they were never able to address certain things. Like I would have been more than happy to talk about the sort of back and forth and the laws that led to the privileges, like the practices that led to the privileges, right? I would have loved to have a conversation about Shelby v. Holder and how it stripped parts of the Voting Rights Act that led to the impact of disproportionately disenfranchising not only Black Americans in their ability to vote, but all Americans in their ability to vote. And we saw that during COVID. And then under the same breath, the consequence of Shelby v. Holder led to SB 202 in Georgia or Alabama HB 56. 56, which in Alabama 56 and HB 56 was a law that requires that police have reasonable suspicion that a person is an immigrant unlawfully present in the United States, and in the midst of a legal stop, detention, or arrest, they can make the reasonable attempt to determine that person's legal status. A privilege is that you can get pulled over and not get questioned about your legal status in the United States. All of us have that benefit. But for Latin Americans, with this very law, HB 56, they don't have that desire, right? Which is, again, this is where we get to the privilege, that they're not going to get questioned if they talk to their daughter in Spanish to get their license and registration in the car. So again, this conversation has to be much longer, and it's very unfortunate that it ended up the way that it did.
Gotcha. Yeah, we'll have you back on, and we'll get a lot in deeper in the future if that's possible. Great discussion. I know I already said it, guys, but great discussion. Regardless, got a little heated. It was still very informative. So just a heads up to the chat. I didn't choose any of your questions because they were either stupid as fuck or they were just loaded. So if you want to ask an actual question to the panelists, actually provide a question.
No, if there were some that were mean towards me, I don't care. I love it when chats are mean to me.
All right. I mean, Dylan was the same way. He was like, "Dude, lay them on me. The loaded, the better." So, okay, I'll keep that in mind for the next one. Okay, so next topic, COVID-19. Despite hearing about not getting back to normal for well another year, the facts are cases are down, deaths are down, and vaccinations are up. And it's looking like, God willing, we're seeing the beginning of the end of COVID-19. How did the U.S. handle it, and why? And would a Biden administration have been better or worse on COVID-19? We'll go ahead and start with, let's go with Joe Lewis. 2 minutes, sir.
Yeah, again, I'm going to only speak for my state when I talk about this, because New Jersey handled COVID incredibly well. And despite that, we still are seeing very poor outcomes. Now, I think one of the things that we should have saw in COVID is a much more aggressive federal response and better transparency when it came to the federal government and how that relates to the states, right? Every state is going to have a different relationship with COVID-19, and there's no denying that. And it's up to the states to make certain decisions in terms of public safety of their citizens, and so the Supreme Court upholds that. Now, with that being said, there is this idea that the rhetoric behind COVID was one of the problems within the Trump administration. I'll agree there. They weren't really clear about their messaging, and despite having every opportunity to be clear, it was very vague. Another thing you can consider is that their overall federal response and the way that the response that they were given may have been insufficient to the Obama administration. We can even make a concession there. However, but it's made incredibly clear that the Biden administration currently in this crisis is the better path forward. Now, we have to remember that despite seeing vaccinations going up, especially in the state of New Jersey, we are still in a situation where cases are going up and deaths are going up. So we got to remember that every state's going to have a different relationship with this. So our responses to how states are dealing with COVID is going to be very predicated on the state's response. So we want to make sure that's important when we're walking into this.
All right, well said. Mr. Tiberius, go ahead, sir. 2 minutes.
Okay, so there's levels where I do know stuff on this, and there's levels where I'm a little bit ignorant as far as general policy. I can tell you that Joe Biden, first day in office, threw 3 executive orders in regards to how they was going to handle COVID, mask mandates, the like. I don't know exactly what all was in those, so there's some issues here. This kind of gets a little partisan too, because there's just a level of, all right, cool. I'm just going to throw it out here. The Pfizer vaccine rolled out in December. So, and then we had Moderna in February at the very beginning, if I remember right. And the whole thing that I'm going to just throw out here is that it's a little weird to compare these two with one basically not having the tools to do somewhat of anything. I mean, we can talk about how if the Trump administration failed with mask mandates, that kind of thing, or we can talk about how Biden's kind of just on the cleanup stretch. And so can we talk about, hey, was mask mandates enforced better? You know, did one have a better plan for how distribution was going to go? Yeah, but a lot of this is just overtly partisan at that point. I get lost in this very, very easily personally. So that's my opening.
Okay, Sansel, go ahead. 2 minutes.
Yeah, so there's no way that we could possibly know if a Biden administration would do better than Trump administration because there's only one timeline that we can observe. So, what I would have liked to have seen, like Joe Lewis said, I would have liked to have seen a stronger federal response. Everything that I've seen is that we didn't really the federal government didn't really empower the states to be able to take matters into their hands effectively. The federal government has more resources at their disposal to acquire PPE, to research the virus, to make uniform rules so that we can, not have such a disjointed response. So that's something that I would have liked to have seen. In terms of like the vaccine, the fact that we were able to make a vaccine in such a short amount of time is a very good thing. Biden rolling it out in such a short amount of time and getting it into people's arms so quickly is a feat of great magnitude that the federal government has done a great job on. But we don't know for sure if Trump would have done better. So I'd be interested to hear what everyone is specifically going to say in this conversation. I'm more interested to see where the conversation goes.
Sure. And Rob Noor, go ahead. 2 minutes, sir.
Yeah, so I just want to say I'm shocked to hear Joe Lewis say New Jersey did a good job. Literally, New Jersey is in like top 5 worst places in the world for how they handled COVID. Their per capita deaths, their infection rates, and everything. Like, so if you think that was a successful job, your standards are really low on it. As far as the difference between Biden and Trump, Sonsol's right about one thing: we can never really know, right? Because they're both operating at different times, so it's impossible to know. But we could guess based on the rhetoric. Now, all of the praise that the media is heaping on Biden is basically just continuing the plans that Trump was doing. Like, the hard part, remember, many people that were Democrats, media, and health experts told us that it would be impossible to develop a vaccine before Trump left office. They kept saying Trump was lying. He's giving false hope. Then it turns out that was actually accurate. So the hard work was getting the vaccine. How much of that was because of Trump and his plan? I don't know. But certainly that occurred under the Trump administration. What would Biden have done different? Well, basically, we had about 1 million vaccines a day going out under Trump. Now that number's increased slightly, but you would expect that as we get new vaccines created and a better distribution system. We do know this. Things that were important to lower the rates of COVID were things like stopping travel internationally. Trump tried to stop travel from China. Joe Biden said that was xenophobic. We see Joe Biden right now unwilling to have he'll call China out for almost anything except the fact that they lied, and the virus probably came from a lab. But even aside from that, they lied about infection rates and human transmissions and stuff, which led to this travesty occurring all around the world, far worse than it would have if China told the truth. Biden's unwilling to say anything about it. In fact, he says it's racist to bring it up. At least that's what his team's saying, that it increases hate crimes against Asian Americans. We see Biden's policy at the southern border, how he's leaving that open border and people basically go untested to be released into the country. So if Biden had been there all along, I don't know what he would have done differently, since he's just continued the plans that Trump had. And then all the stuff that's different would have just been horribly worse. Having said that, I think Trump could have done things better. I think that this was politicized. The lockdowns and things like that were terrible. And that it's a shame that we still didn't have adequate testing from Trump, Republicans, or Democrats by the time Trump left office.
All right, panelists, it is open to open discussion. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I want to kind of take a small little jab at what Rob said about the Garden State, because even though, yes, there are certain aspects of the Murphy administration that I have questions about, no different than what New York is going through right now. But to say that COVID in New Jersey is being handled poorly is a little bit disingenuous, especially when we're looking for what we're looking for the end game is within our landscape, right? New Jersey's in the top 5 among vaccination distribution. We're third at 88%. Comparatively, when we look at states that distribute at the same level that we did, we'll get to go as far down to Texas to get to anywhere close. We're at 88%. Other states are barely hitting the 70 percentile. Other states that are doing better than us, we're in the same percentile. North Dakota is somewhere in the 88%. Minnesota is at 89%. So it seems very clear that states on the East Coast, when we look at that, New Jersey is far and away ahead when it comes to vaccine distribution on the East Coast. So even if you have qualms about how we got here, you cannot deny that the vaccine distribution and administration within this landscape that we're dealing, a landscape where we want people vaccinated, is significantly better than every single state that any of you are in right now. So
I think this illustrates a fundamental difference between Joe Lewis and I, and it's going back to the last topic. He'll take he'll take a very specific thing that has nothing to do with the biggest question, and he'll say, well, in this very specific thing, New Jersey's doing good. Dude, but name your rate on infection rates, per capita deaths, total deaths. New Jersey is the worst state on all of those metrics.
If the goal is vaccinations, my state is doing better than yours. And I'm sorry if that's the first time you've heard that.
If the goal is to stop people from dying,
our goal is to make sure that, yes, however, there's still a threshold of deaths that we have to accept. However, the goal for all of our states is making sure that we have as many people as vaccinated as possible. And you cannot deny that New Jersey is doing significantly better than your state. And I'm sorry
why
if that
do we?
upsets you,
let me ask you a
but
question.
that's the truth.
Let me ask you a question. Why do we want people vaccinated? What will that do?
Because then when we have a vaccinated population, we can rely on things like herd immunity. We can create less restrictions on businesses.
What's the end goal of that? We want to stop people from dying, right?
No, we want to stop the spread of COVID-19.
Okay, so in both the spread and in the actual death rates, New Jersey's worst.
That you're not under. What is the goal that we currently are in as of
stop
today?
people from dying and stop the virus from killing people and harming people.
No,
New Jersey's doing worse.
No. You're loading the language. You're loading the language. What is the goal?
No.
Here?
That's quite simple. Like this is like, so if we're talking about race, then instead of if I was said, well, the goal is we want black people to be economically as viable.
We're not talking about race anymore, Rob. We're talking about COVID.
Right. Okay. So then if
what is the goal?
If we're talking about any other subject, you wouldn't say this. You wouldn't say, like it's just the goal is to stop people from dying. You're talking about one thing that could lead to that goal.
So
stopping the spread and the death that comes from this virus. You're talking about one thing that could lead there.
Is that's what
goal? You're talking? I'm talking about the total thing. Think about this. Like, well, yeah, we had the highest per capita death rate in the world, but we got vaccines out slightly quicker than other states.
Slightly quicker.
That's
significantly faster. Significantly faster.
Significantly
and
faster.
if the goal
What's
is vaccinating the
New
population,
Jersey that's vaccinated? What's the percentage of New Jersey that's vaccinated?
88.38 as of today.
Okay, so what's Pennsylvania then?
Pennsylvania is, somewhere in the 80s. I want to say somewhere about 86%.
Okay, so they're 2% better. But
but you got to look at the distribution rate, right? So, and again, I'd have to double check those stats because they might even be in the 80s, right? Because for Pennsylvania, they had about somewhere around 8,000 distributed, but only 7 million, but only 5 million, give or take, actually were administered the vaccination. So that might be closer to the 80 percentile. And even then, I know Pennsylvania ranks in the very bottom of the top 25. They're somewhere like 19th or 20th. Comparatively, right? If we want to get to a point beyond 80%, we have to go all the way up to 16 with Wisconsin. Because I checked it before coming in here, that Wisconsin is 81%.
So we'll leave the audience make up their own. I'm glad you made this argument, Joe, because it really gives an insight to me into how you view things in the world. So
I'm not going to let you charge the language of COVID to fit your narrative. If anybody else thinks that the goal, I'm going to finish this.
That's fine.
There's nothing you can do about it.
That's no problem. That's no problem.
Okay, Rob, go ahead, and then Joe, we'll go to you.
So just to give these two, Joe is super excited because New Jersey is third when it comes to vaccination rates right now. And that rate, I'll admit, vaccination rates in New Jersey is 88.3%. Great. Sounds good. Just so you know, the lowest state, 51, even below Puerto Rico, is Alabama at 62%. So more than half the populations are vaccinated in every state. Joe Lewis is super happy about that 20% difference. He thinks that's awesome. Now let's look at per capita death rates. New Jersey, number one, not only in the United States, but near the top of per capita death rates in the entire world at 276.
Yeah.
276 per 100,000 people dying. That's a huge victory to Joe.
New Jersey has a lot of people very close together.
I never said that was a huge victory. And you got to stop putting words in my mouth like that, Rob. I never do that to you. I've never done that to you in this entire conversation, and you continue to put words in my mouth because you're trying to create an enemy that does not exist.
Okay, guys. Okay, so there's a miscommunication here. Joe, why don't you clear your position? What's your position? State it as clear as possible so we won't get...
My goal is to make sure that the economy reopens, schools reopen, so that we actually enter into a post-COVID-19 landscape. With that being said, vaccinations is the clear goal. That covers everything that Rob would lay out there. That would cover infection rates. That would cover deaths. That would cover businesses opening back up percentages. That would be the percentages of children making it back into school full-time in person without regulations. That could be the alleviation of things like social distancing. That can can lead to alleviation of things like masks. To charge it like I just only care about getting just deaths and infections down is incredibly disingenuous, because when I say I want vaccinations to be as close to 100% as possible so it leads to a post-COVID landscape, all that is encompassed.
Do you think New Jersey did good?
Yes.
New Jersey's probably, if it's definitely the worst state, it's probably top 5 worst governed place in the world for how they dealt with COVID. End of story.
You can't engage with it at all?
Yeah, I can engage with it. Do you want to look at the data?
Where do you live, Rob?
Is that what we need to do?
Where do you live?
Do we want to look at?
Where do you
I
live?
live in Pennsylvania.
What is Pennsylvania's goal for COVID-19?
Pennsylvania's goal would be to stop people from having serious effects from COVID, including death or serious long-term effects.
Would vaccines lead to that goal?
It might.
Why would you say might?
We don't know that. So you're saying that vaccines were 100% proven to be effective?
That's not. I'm asking you why you say might there.
Well, I just said that's
You're
why
charging
I said
the
it
language.
Might.
Answer the question.
No, I'm not charging. You asked me why I said it might. I don't know that vaccines will be 100% effective. Do you?
Well, we do have different types of studies that are showing the effectiveness of vaccines. Like a study that just came out today that shows that a vaccine from Pfizer from the ages of 12 to 15 is shown to be 100% effective from preventing people from getting COVID-19. So it seems to be that getting a vaccination can lead to less COVID.
Okay, so I just want to clarify. This is your argument. Let's assume that's true.
It's true. Don't say assume. It's true. And if you don't understand that as a fact, then I'm sorry you're not
Joe,
equipped for this
I'm not
going to
let you get in your high horse. This is I'm going to clip this. This is one of the most laughable things I've ever heard. The worst state in the union.
I give you something that is
when it comes to COVID.
And
this
then
is laughable. So don't get your high horse here. I'm saying I will assume it to be true.
If the goal is to do something, and he's giving you how we get to that thing, and he's saying we're doing good and how to make that thing stop happening, and then you say still that that's not good enough. Like, I don't know what your argument is here. You're just harping on something that he's not saying.
Let me break it down to you real quick, Sonso. The reason that vaccinations theoretically would be good is because it will stop the devastating effects of COVID. Right? So if your state has been,
that's what we're saying.
Excuse me. If your state has been literally the worst when it came to how they handled COVID, the fact that there are 20% more people vaccinated than the lowest state right now isn't a measure of your state doing good. For example, if my goal was as a state of Pennsylvania, where I live, if Pennsylvania, real quick, if Pennsylvania, by far worse than any other state, had the highest rate of cops killing unarmed black men, but then I said, but when it comes to new legislation, Pennsylvania's top. You'd say, who gives a shit? Look how many people are dead. That's what you would say.
When you say legislation, do you mean specifically like legislation to make cops stop killing people, or are you just talking about them passing bills? Okay,
legislation to make cops stop killing people.
That would be a lagging indicator, because you have to wait for those things to actually take effect. But when we're talking about vaccinations, something that will stop the spread of COVID going forward, and if he's talking about right now, if we're trying to make COVID stop from growing worse than it is right now, then yes. If they're the highest percentage right now, then that would be a good thing, right? That's what his argument is. I don't think you're understanding.
So hold on. Let me step in here. Let me try to maybe tether us together, right? So I think where Rob is coming from is saying that New Jersey handled it the worst or bad, and Joe is saying New Jersey is handling it one of the best. Is that where we're getting at? I think Rob is referring to the past, and Joe's referring to right now. I think that's where the disconnect. So maybe we can talk about both. Maybe if one of the panels can be like, okay, handling, let's talk about this first.
Right. So to be as clear as possible, like, we can look at how states handled something and have a conversation of how we can improve in certain places, right? That's why we can look back at the Trump administration and say, okay, this was bad. How can we make it so that there's a better path forward? Right. But one of the things that have shown to be one of the leading causes in making sure we can make it back into a post-COVID landscape, which is what I'm talking about here. We are currently, the goal is to get to a post-COVID landscape, is vaccinations. So if you don't think that vaccinations are going to lead to a post-COVID landscape, I would need to, as clear as possible, have here an articulation of what could lead to a post-COVID landscape that has a higher significance than vaccinations.
Okay, so to answer this, what it is, it's an irrelevant question. So I'll just respond like this. Clearly, you think Donald Trump was the best ever when it came to dealing with COVID, right? I don't want to hear you talk about how many people died and stuff because the vaccine came out under Trump, right? And the goal is to get people vaccinated. Therefore, Trump is the man. I don't know. I don't want to hear about
the vaccine. Okay, so when you say under Trump, we have to be incredibly clear on what we mean by that. So what do you mean by under Trump?
Trump had something called Operation Warp Speed. The Democrats said it would be impossible for the vaccine to come out. Yet, due to the leadership of Trump, we got a vaccine.
Was the first vaccine because of Operation Warp Speed?
The majority of the vaccines that we got in the United States.
I'm asking you about the first vaccine.
Did the first vaccine that came from Germany, is that the one that we're taking overwhelmingly in the United States that resulted in 88% in New Jersey?
I'm asking you, was the first vaccine
because
of Operation Warp Speed?
The vast majority of the 88% of people that are vaccinated in New Jersey are because of vaccines that were developed under Operation Warp Speed. Correct?
Was the first vaccine
you can't answer
due to
the
Operation
question.
Warp
No, the first
because
vaccine
the thing
wasn't.
is, Rob, you're getting really wiggly.
You are
here.
such a worthless, pathetic individual. You're just worthless. Let me answer quickly. No, the first vaccine was not from Operation Warp Speed. Yes. Now, let me ask you, was the vast majority of the 88% of people that got a vaccine in New Jersey a result of the vaccines that came about from Operation Warp Speed?
Look, man, if you're going to ad hom me, I'm just going to talk to Tiberius.
There you go.
Okay. Like, again, Rob,
so
I want to make this incredibly clear to you, right?
No.
I'm not going to let you slide in this. I'm not going to let you slide in this.
Ron and Rob can't even fucking not.
Okay, all right, guys.
This is the kind of thing that I can't fucking.
Stop.
Aftershock.
Guys, hold on. All right. No one is going to speak now. Tiberius, go ahead.
Okay, so this is my take on this. Whether New Jersey handled it well or not, I don't really know. I was just going over a little bit of data I found. The definitive point here is that I don't care, honestly, because I'm not a I'm not a citizen of New Jersey. I'm a citizen of the United States, and I might have something to say about how New Jersey fits into that picture, but I just legitimately have better shit to worry about. I'm sorry, I do. If we're talking about like what do we do from here on out for COVID, let's talk about like how can we get vaccines to people who don't have it now. Joe was talking about 80%. I'm looking at like 30% across the board for everybody. So I don't know what numbers we're all looking at. But yeah, let's figure out how we're going to do that. That's a far more relevant conversation. We could talk about if Biden's doing okay, or what he can do better. 100%.
Tiberius, can I ask you?
Yeah, I'm listening.
How can we evaluate how good someone's doing if we can't even agree the state that did the worst if we think they did good? Where can we have a conversation if we can't even agree on that level? What's this conversation? How do we decide? Let me just ask you, Tiberius, to steel man what I think Joe's trying to say. Vaccination, the vast majority of them that were used in the United States came about as a result of Operation Warp Speed, correct?
Okay, yeah, I'm with you on this.
Okay, so wouldn't that mean, according to the rationale of Joe Lewis, the way you understand it, we should not look at, we're discussing, did Trump do good? Would he have done better than Biden? We can't look at the deaths. We don't look at the deaths. We don't look at the spread of COVID. The end goal is to get people vaccinated. And because the majority of these vaccinations came out under Trump, Trump did awesome and better than Joe Biden. End of story.
Okay.
Are you saying that most vaccinations happened while Trump was in office?
The vaccines that were created that were told would be impossible, the ones that are most used in the United States, came out as under Donald Trump. And
okay,
because
so your entire
Operation
argument is hinged on Operation Warp Speed.
Right. Well, actually, that's Joe's argument. My entire argument is this. We should evaluate things like vaccines that came out, how things were handled in each state or each country before the vaccinations came out. We should look at the raw data of how many infections there were, how many hospitalizations, how many people died per capita. That's my argument. Joe's argument is we ignore all of that. We just look at the vaccination percentage.
Again, Rob, you're creating an enemy that doesn't exist. So you keep strawmanning me. I don't understand it. Like, I don't know if it's a comprehension thing. I don't know if it's a retention of information thing. I don't know what it is. Again,
do you think New Jersey did good?
Yes.
They didn't.
Okay.
Let him explain.
Okay, like, one of the problems here is that what is your evidence that New Jersey did not do good? You're citing all these things. We can't make an objective look at this because we are still in COVID. Everybody's doing poorly, but we can look at, however, where we need to go. And where we need to go is to make sure that people are vaccinated, as many people as possible.
Okay, so real quick, guys, because I think I'm right in the disconnect here. So let's tackle this stage by stage, and we'll do it in terms of past to present. Okay, so past, obviously the goals before the vaccine were different than the goals after the vaccine. Obviously the goals are still, keep everyone alive after the vaccine, but the primary goal is to get people vaccinated after the vaccine comes out, correct? So let's do this like step by step. So let's do it first. While COVID was in the US, it was, cases were going up, we didn't have the vaccine. How were states doing? Let's go there, and then we'll jump to, okay, now the vaccine is here, how did the states do it? So let's do the first one first. Vaccine's not here, cases are going up, oh shit, COVID, go.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Joe. How'd Jersey do?
It's a mixed bag. On one hand, we had a much faster response than most other states in terms of regulations. However, one of the problems that every state suffered with in some level or degree is that there wasn't a proper time frame to create actual plans. So what happened is a lot of states were basically functioning in this weird sort of relationship where we don't really have the proper guidance within our business or our school or wherever. So we're going to look towards the federal government to see what we can do. And the communication there was incredibly insufficient. This is something that Governor Murphy complained about pretty much every day in every single press conference. However, something that I think every governor should have done is at least just make a decision so that everybody underneath them can have very clear guidelines. Now, one of the problems that every state suffered from, Jersey especially, is that in the COVID landscape, to Aftershock's point, is that, or really to make sure I'm answering this question as direct as possible, we levied up restrictions too soon. But again, one of the issues was that when COVID hit, we had a buffer in a lot of systems, right? So what I mean by buffers in a lot of systems is that you can make a decent excuse to making things
Holy
virtual.
shit, how long are we going to go with these answers? Let me ask you this. Is it possible to compare state to state? Is it possible to compare state to state?
No.
Can we say one state did good and another state did bad?
It depends on what your metrics are for good, right?
Exactly. So what metrics will we try to use?
We can use we can use a bunch of different metrics.
Give me some.
What I want to bring this to is federal response versus state response. Why was it that our federal response was so limited? Why do people think that the federal response being limited was a good thing? Like, that's the sort of thing that I would like to talk about, because I think that the federal response being so fucking limited was fucking garbage. It's really fucking unacceptable, the fact that we sat here for fucking, like, we knew that COVID was going to come to our shores. That's something that was going to happen. That's what happens when you have a fucking pandemic. It's going to every country in the world. We're going to have the pandemic. We sat on our fucking hands after we knew that there was a pandemic and did not prepare PPE. We didn't prepare strategies. We didn't prepare fucking anything until it was already like starting to spread in communities in the United States. That is a huge failing of the federal government. All right. If the topic that we're talking about is Trump's response versus Biden's response, this is what I would like to talk about. If we were fucking smart, as soon as we knew that there was going to be a pandemic, a respiratory disease that was going to be spreading in communities in our country, we should have been planning from day fucking one. We should have had a federal response with, this is what we need to do here, this is what we need to do here. We should have been planning to get PPE. We should have been planning to get fucking respirators, but we fucking didn't. Why?
Yeah,
okay, so now that I don't disagree with almost anything you said. I think that there needed to be I think that we should leave it up more to the states with the actual individual policies they wanted, but I think there was a failure at the federal government, absolutely. A lot of the things are exaggerated, like PPE and stuff. Remember, we were told that Trump didn't have ventilators, that Cuomo was outraged at how many people would die, and then it turned out all those ventilators, we had so many of them that we ended up shipping them to other states and things like that. But I agree that at every level, at the state and at the federal level, Republican and Democrat, I haven't seen one leader that I'm impressed with. I continue to believe that with Joe Biden. However, the point is this: there's a greater thing happening in this conversation than just the conversation about COVID. And that is, how do we have disagreements if we can't agree on base level things, right? So I understand that, Sansel, you want to shift the conversation because what
it's
you're
going
saying
fucking
is
nowhere.
Because right, it's going nowhere because it's impossible to. Because before we make comparisons to how do we know if one side did good or did better than another side, we need to agree what the metrics would be that we're looking at. So metrics would be
I think
things
this
like
would broaden it so that we can hone it. That's why I'm broadening it.
Okay,
so we can
so let's
hone it.
hone
That's
it.
why I'm
so
doing
when we look at the problems that you say the federal, how do you know there are problems? What are the metrics that you're looking at and saying clearly this was a disaster because we can see blank? What is it that you saw that you were like, oh, okay?
Each individual state had to fight on the global market for PPE. Every state had different metrics for when they were going to shut down, when they were going to open up. These are all important things because we have interstate commerce.
Okay, let me ask you this.
Like, that's why I think that a federal response would have been fucking important.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Would you say the same thing over the cold? There wasn't a federal response over the common cold, right?
The cold is not deadly compared to the fucking...
deaths! Wait a minute. Now you're getting
Do
to
you not think
deaths!
that is implied for why we would be locking down? I'm sorry.
No. I do. And so I do. Right. I do. And that's why I wanted you to say it, right? The metrics we look at how many people died. Joe says that's not a metric we should use.
Stop strawmanning me.
You don't understand his point, so stop bringing him up. Answer my fucking question. Why is it not a good thing? Why is it a good thing that we had such a fucking distorted fucking response?
I never advocated
Stop fucking bringing up his
and then I listen to
It's goddamn really annoying. It's annoying for me. Right the fuck here.
Okay, everyone's muted. Everyone's muted. Everyone is muted, guys. Chill. All right. Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to Joe because he feels he's being strawmanned. Joe, why don't you clear your position, and then we'll go to Rob. Maybe he'll restate it and maybe reformulate his argument. What have you.
I'm not diminishing the deaths of Americans. I care deeply about that. As somebody who has lost over 100 of my friends and colleagues, especially in the entertainment industry, an industry that the federal government and every state government ignored. I have friends who are in the entertainment industry who are homeless. I have friends who are in the entertainment industry who are homeless and then died. Deaths I take incredibly seriously. So this idea that I don't care about deaths because I acknowledge...
No one said that. Now you're strawmanning me.
No
one said you
didn't
care about deaths.
Never.
You are.
In my argument, have I ever said...
salad piece
you
of
are
shit.
the most disingenuous fuck I've ever fucking seen. You have for the last fucking 30 minutes strawman the fuck and said the exact same goddamn thing. I can't fucking believe it.
Okay, I see. Guys, hold on. I see what happened. I see what's going on. Let me address this real quick, okay? Just so we can get back on track. So I understand where both of you are coming from. I see the disconnect. Okay, so Rob basically, Joe, is saying that he's not saying you don't care about the deaths, but what Rob is getting at is that is probably the best indicator on how a state did in regards to COVID. And he's saying that you don't want to use that. He's not saying that you don't care. He's saying that is not at the top of your priority. And that's his top priority, are deaths. And obviously you care about deaths, but that's not your main thing. And that's why Rob is saying that deaths are definitely what we should focus on the most. And I think that's where he's getting at. Rob, is that where...
Yes, we are trying to get... Sonsol even admitted it. We have to have metrics for how we can compare how well one leader did to another. Sonsol admits, of course he's implying deaths are a metric that we would look at. So if we look at that, the reason I'm saying Joe doesn't think we should use that metric is continually he said New Jersey did well, and we could see by every measure when it comes to infections, hospitalization rates, death rates, and things like that, New Jersey was far and away the worst in the United States. So what metric is Joe using that outweighs that metric?
Sansa, hold on, because this was between Joe and Rob. I'll bring you in. I promise.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
so something that we tried to do, and it seems like you're failing to do so, is that we need to have a very important conversation, as Aftershock laid out, that we need to talk about the goals in a pre-vaccination landscape and a post-vaccination landscape. In a pre-vaccination landscape, every state is going to have different priorities, right? So one for New Jersey, as an example, was that we had a disproportionate amount of students who did not have access to the internet or access to a computer. Finally, a year later, that is zero. At the time, multiple times across that, it floated around like 50% and 40%. But while we were giving people access to the internet and access to a device, this was still all in all a net good for the Murphy administration. However, one thing that you can acknowledge that is a failure in a pre-vaccination landscape was how Governor Murphy handled nursing homes and secondary care facilities when it came to the response of people who were okay to leave the emergency room areas or the COVID areas because they were after the 2-week period, but they still showed signs of infection rates. However, something that Murphy did when he saw this happen, he overcorrected and created a task force designed specifically to track nursing homes as well as senior care facilities. Now, if you look just north of me into New York City, New York did not do that. So, objectively speaking, you can say, hey, New Jersey did something that's better than New York. However, I think we all would argue that we want to make sure that every state has a similar response to the problems, because as you laid out, Rob, one of the things that if you spread COVID, that's bad. Spreading COVID leads to deaths. That's also bad. So how do we curtail these two things? Because we can't hyper-focus on one individual. We have to be able to tackle every single issue at once. And without a federal response and a pre-vaccination landscape, it made it incredibly difficult, which was Sonsol's point.
Okay, now I'll give a 5-minute response because apparently that's how we do it. So what you're lacking is we're literally talking now about we shouldn't look at the death rates and the amount of people that died. We shouldn't look at the fact that actually Murphy forced nursing homes to accept COVID patients, which led to the highest per capita death rate in the United States and one of the highest rates in the world because kids got access to the internet. So that proves that they did good. Please don't interrupt. I let you talk. I let you talk. And everyone in the chat's going to be like, Rob, just leave Joe talk. Every single time I talk, you interrupt. Every single time.
I don't read
so
chat,
you say
I'm sure I don't the same thing.
I don't give a shit if you read it or not. Shut up while I'm talking. Now, when we see that you want to use all of these disparate measures to say like, well, we think New Jersey did good despite their death rates because they had different goals. And one of those goals was getting people access to the internet and kids getting access to the internet. I'm sorry, but I think that pales in importance to the amount of people that are dying from COVID. And by that metric, which is a metric, at least you could say there are other metrics we should use. But when I give you an opportunity to say these other metrics, you end up saying things like, well, each state had different goals, and one of the goals of New Jersey was to get people access to internet. And so if we're using that metrics, now there's nobody that doesn't have access to internet, so we can see that actually New Jersey did really good. The question that we're talking about right now is before the vaccinations. I don't understand how anyone in good faith, when your original argument was, well, New Jersey's doing good because they have the third highest percentage of people vaccinated, I don't know how you in good faith wouldn't at least meant, okay, before the vaccination came, of course they were horrible. They were the worst, and they were the worst in case rates, hospitalization rates, and fatality rates. Of course they did poor. But even then you say they did good, which I would assume good means better than at least 50% of the other states in this country. We can't have a conversation on this, and I'm glad that we had this, because what you do is you just talk on and on and on, and it's indicative to the way you debate and the other things. You're not really saying anything. And the fact that you can't answer a simple question or live in the reality where you could see the state that literally did the worst by the metrics that every normal person would say. How many people were hospitalized? How many people died? Oh, that state did the worst. The fact that you're like, no, it's nuance. We shouldn't be looking at those criteria first and foremost. Instead, we should be looking at internet rates. And it's indicative of how you would argue on a multitude of issues. So, for example, if we're trying to have conversations on race and other things like that, it's clear that you're going to deflect to defend your side no matter what. Even if the data clearly shows that something's wrong or something's bad that happened on your side, you'll say we shouldn't look at that data point. We should instead look at this unrelated data point that has nothing. We can't have comparisons from state to state. We can't have comparison from group to group. This is indicative of how you'll argue every issue and how so many people on the left do. It's very simple. Even Sonsol says at one point, when I say, would you do this for the cold? He says, of course not. The cold's not deadly. Right. The reason that we're concerned about things like vaccination rates, the reason we're concerned about things like, no, I'm going to keep talking. I'm going to keep stopping.
Because you've been talking for like 10 minutes. I know it seems like Joe. I know it seems like Joe talked for 45 minutes, but it's only because you're spending so goddamn long trying to interpret what he says. It's stupid to understand it.
Please be quiet. I have 5 more minutes worth of shit.
You can't understand the initial point. How do you, the reason why no, holy fucking shit. I'm going to fucking speak now.
I'm not going to leave you interrupt me. I'm not going to leave you interrupt me. Nope, it's not going to happen. It's not going to interrupt me. It's not going to, you're not going to interrupt me. You're not going to.
Both of you are
You're not going to interrupt me. You're not going to interrupt me. I don't care. You keep talking. No one can hear you. You're not going to interrupt me.
You dumb piece of shit.
It's not going to happen.
You absolutely
I'm not going to let you talk over me. It's not going to happen. Like, all you want to do is interrupt me. You want to go up on these soliloquies, and then when I try to say just get to the point, you say stop interrupting and leave me get to the point. So it's going to
the
take me
virus
15
in your
minutes.
lungs
No,
before
no,
you
no,
die,
Sansel,
right?
guys,
You can't just
you-
die.
hold on.
I know we're muted. I just hate this motherfucker.
That's
Holy
gonna
fucking
Guys,
shit.
guys.
I've never
That's
met someone so
all-
fucking
Just
unintelligent in
going
my
on
entire
and on
life.
and he wants to interrupt me and
I don't think
over
they
me
can
and
hear each
things like
other.
that.
Yeah, we can hear each other.
I hear him. I'm not going to leave him interrupt me. I'm going to finish my point.
Guys,
I got
okay,
another
okay.
10 minutes.
No, the reason I can't let you keep going is because you're not
Okay, hold
understanding
on.
what
I
we're saying.
get it, guys. Hold on, guys.
Now I want to talk about access to things like
You're
sharp
stepping. You're going
Okay,
one step
muted,
like ahead of yourself. You're
Muted,
going way
muted,
too far.
muted.
One step
Everyone
too
is
far
muted,
ahead.
guys. There's nothing more I can do. I just know that we can't hear you guys. Just stop. Just stop. I understand. We all want to be heard. I get it. I get it.
can't imagine
Joe,
you
you've been
interrupt
talking
me.
a lot. So has Rob. It's all. We just need to get control. Okay. So hold on, guys. Hold on. Okay. So what we're gonna do, Rob, just go ahead and close out your question, and then we'll go to Sansel.
Okay, so I got another 5 minutes. So anyways, when we look at court cases and things like that have happened in the past, and when we're focusing on internet rates, because clearly that's what everyone out there that's listening knows this. When we're talking about COVID and things like that, the question we're really seeking to answer is, how are kids getting on the internet? Like, what are they doing with that? And like we saw with Murphy, not only did he put COVID patients in nursing homes, which led to all these deaths, he also did things like kept liquor stores open while he closed down churches and things like that. Also, they're one of the people that are denying science and that are locking down schools, which I've had that conversation with Joe Lewis before. It might surprise the audience to know Joe Lewis and his superintendent know more than the CDC when it comes to operating schools and keeping them open. So that was something that happened in the past. So when we look at all those things, clearly the metrics we need to look at aren't how many people died or how many infections or how many hospitalization rates. The real metric, as everyone knew when they came into this debate, was how much access do kids have to the internet. There, I finished my point. Go ahead.
All right.
Yeah,
So
so
again,
hang on,
so
Sansel. I want to make
I'm-
something a little bit more
yeah.
clear here.
Okay.
In my statement, I acknowledged the failure that Governor Murphy did on nursing homes and care facilities. I also acknowledged he overcorrected with the response team. Did you miss that when I was talking?
No, I definitely heard that. And that's what does
Gotcha.
that have anything to do with the death? Why is that bad? Why was it bad that he made a mistake with the nursing homes? How do we know that was bad? What happened?
So
I
this is what I want to say.
never
Hold on, Rob.
said-
All right. So I'm going to speak for 5 minutes, and then you can interrupt me because I let you speak in circles for fucking 5 minutes.
No,
all
no,
right?
no, wait. Stop. No
you
more
go.
talking for 5 minutes. No, everyone has been talking. I mean, like, obviously, Sansel and Ty have been a little bit more. But, guys, both of you have been talking a lot, okay, on both sides. So this needs to stop. Like, I'm being honest. This needs to stop. We're going to keep things short. Okay, Sansel, go ahead.
All right, cool. So I am just absolutely blown away because you want to focus on deaths, and I agree, deaths are bad. I think that when people die, it is a sad and bad thing, and when people are alive, it's a good thing, right? But in order to keep people alive, right, what do we have to do? We have to keep people from being infected, right? You're going one step ahead of what you're trying to prevent. You're not trying to prevent death. You're trying to prevent infection, which would then lead to death. So when you're saying we're trying to prevent death, we're trying to prevent the causal link to death, right? So when Joe brings up all these things that like we can do to prevent death by way of preventing infection, it makes you sound very stupid when you keep on jumping to death because we're trying to talk about how to stop infections because it also stops people from fucking dying, right? That's why I keep on trying to say we're walking around in circles because you're going one step too far when we have to talk about the first thing first. How do we stop people from getting infected? Well, we get them the mask. We get them to fucking put the vaccine in their arm. We get them to do like a million other things that we all say is a good thing. Social distancing, staying home, or like, not sitting inside a crowded area where everyone's like breathing and inhaling each other's air, right? These are all things that we can do to prevent death. But what is it primarily doing? Preventing infections. That's what Joe keeps on saying. We want to get the fucking vaccine in people's arms to prevent infections because it doesn't directly hold on. Just because you get the injection doesn't mean that it's not going to let you die. It's going to make you not get infected. It's not a serum to keep people from dying indefinitely, right? I don't know what the fuck your issue is between like the brain to the ear connection that like then goes to your mouth where you try to like explain your information. It's just absolutely fucking incredible to me. I would love to hear what Tiberius says because his points are so much more salient than yours.
So Tiberius needs to step out. So CTV wants to step in to replace him. Ty, do you want to say like a closing statement?
Yeah, like as far as my thoughts on this conversation, I lost it in the weeds somewhere about 30 minutes ago. But like the real question I would like to ask you guys, what matters is number one is that are you satisfied with the way your state handled it, and then are you satisfied with the way the Trump administration handled it and the Biden administration handled it? I'm just gonna fire off with me. I think Hoosiers did pretty well. We didn't top the records by any match, but we were usually in the middle, like consistently around place 25. So I'm not going to cry river over it. As far as the federal government, I have criticisms of both administrations. I highly criticize the Trump administration getting rid of the disease prevention unit. Like they're one of the last things they ever published was a study on Wuhan back in 2018, and literally just goes to show like what they feared happened. Now, I still have also criticisms of the Biden administration, particularly with what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, where he's not actively saying, hey, look, states, you're not done yet. You're letting out a little too early. Give it a couple more months. We'll be fine. And we're seeing numerous states, both Democrat and Republican alike, get rid of their COVID restrictions, and we're seeing a spike in cases right now, which goes to the point that, yeah, we're seeing infectivity come back, and it's too soon. So, good to see you, CTV. I'm Tiberius D. I run Geopolitics with Tiberius D. If you like what I said tonight, I appreciate a follow. I'll post up in the chat just real quick. CTV, take it away, my guy.
Hey, what's up, y'all?
Quick, Ty, thank you so much for stepping in, man. You came in clutch. I really appreciate it, guys. Tiberius D, go follow him on all his social media. And yeah, post it in the chat, please. Thank you so much.
All right. Do we want to leave CTV talk, or can I respond to Sonso? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, CTV. COVID-19. Basically, how did the U.S. handle it? All that good stuff. What do you think?
You know what? I feel like, because I've actually been watching what's been going on here. I am going to give my time to Rob, but Rob, right? Like if I need to say something, you gotta let me say something. Does that work?
Sure.
All right, go for it.
So I'll explain. Sonso, first aftershock. The question that we were talking about was we're breaking it into before the vaccine and after the vaccine, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So when Sonso talks about how I might not be hearing things, and then proceeds to talk about how the vaccine is showing how good New Jersey does, that's actually him not.
I didn't
hearing
say any.
things
Did I say New Jersey one fucking time?
You talked about how vaccinations are what we're not just looking at deaths, we're trying to prevent people, which is why vaccinations, blah, 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 and what Joe is saying, and you're just not hearing it. This has nothing to do with vaccinations.
Rob,
it doesn't matter if you said New Jersey. You said what Joe was saying about vaccinations. So now that we're looking,
so I want you to tell me when I said New Jersey.
Let me ask you a couple questions here. One, do you acknowledge that New Jersey had the highest per capita death rate?
I don't have the stats right in front of me. No, I don't know.
But Joe does.
If you guys say it's true, then it's true. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Secondly, do you think that those death rates also were because there were a lot more people that were infected there per capita?
Yeah. But
okay.
do you not understand why I said the things that I did? Do you not understand the entire point?
I do understand why you said, but here's the problem. You have it in reverse. Right, that's the problem.
No, it's literally you can't die before you get infected, dude. That's
hold on, Sonso.
Right, I agree. You die. I agree. You die before you get infected. So both in infection per capita and in death per capita, New Jersey did the worst.
Okay, but I never said
anything about this in defense of Joe's point, which you were trying to defend Joe and malign me? How is it a defense of Joe's point that New Jersey did well?
You wanted to jump on this a minute ago, Sonso.
No,
you wanted to take it off of Joe because they were
actively getting brain cancer.
Right.
Well, then that's where that's why a minute ago you needed to let Rob and Joe hash this shit out, right? Because frankly, the Bears not going to stop, right, until the point is made, right? So, Rob and Joe.
But there's no point.
Since it's about New Jersey, and that was where that was at, right? So,
right.
Yeah. So,
right. So,
you just made the argument for me. You literally made. Yes, it's not just about deaths. It's about infections. It's about death. But that's the end result, right? When we're talking about things that could mitigate those, it only matters what the end results were, right? Like, for example, we could right now, all of us could think right now, the best thing you could do is wear 3 masks. Like, let's say as a panel, we all come to that conclusion. But if we all wear 3 masks and the infection rates and the death rates don't get solved, then we wouldn't say, oh, but all that matters is we all wore 3 masks. At the end of the day, the way we look as to whether a state was successful or not is we look at the data. And the things that matter are things like how many people got infected, how many people had serious consequences that required hospitalization, how many people died. And New Jersey was the worst at all of those. So that's what I don't understand.
But we also
Especially
have to,
if we're
no, I
arguing
agree. You have to look
vaccination.
at the data, right? But we also have to look, you can't just look at data, because you also have to understand that some places are intrinsically going to have more infections and more deaths because of multitudes of things. So a place like Alabama is going to have a lower population density, right? That's one of the things that when we look at places like New York, New Jersey, places like California, where they have a huge, like, fucking metropolitan line of fucking cities. These are places that are just intrinsically going to have a higher infection rate, intrinsically going to have a higher death rate. This is just something that is true, because in order for you to get sick, it has to be within close proximity of people. You have to be, that's the thing. When you have a higher density area, there's going to be more infections. That's the problem why you see places like Los Angeles and places like New York have higher death.
Let me ask you, California is 27th when it comes to per capita death rates. New Jersey's 1. So how would you say that New Jersey's a success by that metric?
I'm honestly not surprised that New Jersey did the way that they did, simply because, like, whenever I was out hauling cars all over the country, every single time I went into New Jersey, my dog Scrappy had to take a shit. I don't know why.
Yeah, there's also
but that's just the way it was.
Right after you go over the Trenton Makes Bridge. So for those of you who are like watching at home, once you go back to Trenton Makes Bridge on the Pennsylvania side, you just get wafted with shit. So TTV's dog's been shitting over there. But I know you have to come over to my state through PA. So
or you can come up through Delaware, right?
Oh, true.
Yeah.
So one of the problems,
and a serious point. Oh, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, one of the problems with the per capita deaths is that, and this is one of the reasons why Jersey really needed a better federal response, is because Jersey is this middle for the entire East Coast when we're looking at Pennsylvania to New York to Washington, D.C. So not only do we have a lot of individuals working in the state that are out of state, we also have individuals who are working outside of the state going back into the state. So one of the things that I wanted Governor Murphy to do was be incredibly clear when it came to access in and out of New Jersey. Granted, there's a bunch of challenges because of civil liberties and the navigation and the fact that there wasn't a clear response to things like unemployment. So there were other issues there. Like, I'm not diminishing the problem of per capita, but we also have to acknowledge that New Jersey is very different from other states because we are a very population dense state comparative to size. Right. And even when you look at the bottom 5 or whatever list that you look out for per capita deaths, none of those states even breached 4,000 Americans. We have a state close to with 9 million Americans with a state that's not even, you have to fit two or three pieces of New Jersey just to make it to the size of Pennsylvania.
So then how good would New Jersey have had to do before? Because now you're saying, well, we can't really compare it because they're so dense. Right, that's what you. So this is the frustration, and this is why I said it's impossible to have this.
Don't riff. Just get to your point. Get your point.
We keep moving the goalpost because you said that it was possible to compare state to state. Now you're saying, well, we can't. Even though New Jersey had the worst rates, there's these factors like population density. So if you want, we can compare it to states that have similar population densities and then factor in that as a result and see if New Jersey did better than those states. I've done this. They didn't. So what like we're just going to say, well, now no matter how many deaths New Jersey had, their population dead.
So did you do this research on your own volition, or was this research done by, say, the CDC as an example? I just want to understand where you're coming from with your data.
Well, the research of comparing population density to per capita deaths is something I did my own.
Sure. Did the CDC do this as well?
Why would the CDC do this?
Well, if it's something of a concern, then the CDC would have also done something like this, right?
Right. Well,
or some type of governing body analyzing COVID data.
Well, I mean, they're going to do their own.
We can't look at it's because you're asking for a very. The point is the fact.
I'm asking you. Let me make it as clear as possible.
Right. So let me answer.
If you say something based on your data,
it's because they don't feel that your objection is worth merit. That's why they haven't.
No. Let me make this as clear as possible. If you say that New Jersey was at the bottom at deaths per capita, and then I go to an official source, whether it be the CDC or the state of New Jersey or other governmental bodies when they're doing comparisons of this data, and then I say, oh, this governing body says exactly what Rob is saying, then cool, we can make some sort of conclusion that this data is accurate. However, if you were
Come on,
doing
Joe. Oh, no,
independent,
I got to stop you right there, Joe. Joe, come on,
Sure.
seriously, because the reality at the end of the day is that any evidence that's being gathered, you
someone
would
who
say would have to go
denies
through.
someone who denies
You
that
would say,
vaccine is
hold
the
on,
top of the metric,
hold.
I'm not going to trust
Come
with
on,
leaking
Joe.
data.
Come on, Joe.
I know
Right?
this
No,
is
I
true.
have
Right.
the data.
Right.
He changed the question, so yes, he
So-
changed the
so-
question. I have the data. There's
So-
data that comes from the CDC. I can
Please
point
put
any.
it in chat.
Yes,
Please
just-
put it in chat.
yes,
Put it in the VC
sure.
chat.
Okay,
I'd
the
love to
both
take a
of
look
you,
at it.
chill out for a sec. The both of you, right? So, first off, Joe, your assertion that there needs to be some type of governing body to go over the data first for you to ever take a look at it is, that's not how you look at all the data. Period. Right? There's some evidence that you use out there that didn't specifically go through a governing body in order for you to reach your conclusions. So for you to try to say that like there needs to be an assertion there made by a governing body, right? It's disingenuous from the start because that's not how you philosophically consistently ask for data. Now you might say in this very specific one point is what you would need from that, but when the CDC does do the studies, right, as far as per capita deaths inside of states, and then the only thing that they didn't do, which they did do actually, if you go back and look, is put what the population densities are of the country, but they didn't break it down by state, and then you go and look up what the population density of the state is exactly what Rob is talking about, right? So that right there just tells you that like the governing body that did the population, right, would have been in fact, right, the census. That's how we kind of get where our population numbers are. So there's a governing body for you. So this is where like I just broke all this all the way down, and I'm going to throw it up to Rob.
Yeah, and I linked in chat. I linked directly to the CDC with the map where you can see New Jersey. Their deaths per 100,000 are 275. That's the highest. That's directly from the CDC. You can see that their case per 100,000 in the last 7 days is amongst the highest at 352. So by every single metric,
you're cool,
including
dude. You're
in the
cool.
last
You
7
cited it. You
days.
cited it. I get it. So
Got it.
what I'll do is moving forward, then I'll take a look at it, and if I have to make any type of corrections with what I said on this within this conversation, I'll put it on Twitter or something as a revision. Because I want to move forward from this. So when we're looking at a pre-COVID landscape, what do you feel? What were some prescriptions that you feel would reduce things that you described as a concern for you, like deaths?
Okay, so my recommendation as a non-epidemiologist from the beginning was that there are two types of viruses that could lead to mass deaths. There's a virus that's like highly deadly, but not very infectious. So like something like maybe malaria or something like that. And then there's a virus that could kill a lot of people because the fatality rate's not very high, but it's very infectious. That would be something like influenza. It's clear that the fatality rate, particularly among certain ages of the population for COVID, ended up being far worse than influenza. But nonetheless, those are the two types of diseases you can track. It seemed obvious to me because the disease was here even after the health experts told us everything was safe. Remember, Fauci was saying in January and February that the flu was going to be worse, that fear of COVID was worse. By the time it was here, it was too late to have things like lockdowns that would work. So what we should have done, the way you treat highly infectious viruses with a low case fatality rate, is you protect the most vulnerable populations and you allow the rest of the population to continue to basically live their life as best seen fit. Because one of the things we're doing in this conversation is only talking about the impact directly from COVID. We're not talking about the health impacts, like mental health impacts, physical health impacts, or economic impacts from things like the lockdown. So the best thing to do would have been to protect those nursing home patients that we knew were the most vulnerable, to get as much government resources into places like that as possible. And one of the things that I think we could all agree on that was an unmitigated failure from the top level to even the state level was we didn't provide adequate testing, right? And if we had this testing, I think that it could have alleviated a lot of what we saw.
Do you think that frontline workers that are in areas of high traffic of individuals, such as schools, the restaurant industry, the entertainment industry, and the farming industry, should be included as vulnerable population?
It depends.
On what?
How vulnerable are they?
How do we know the virus is spread?
Okay, so look at it this way. When it comes to serious impacts that come from COVID, we could see that the regular influenza is more deadly and more serious to people under the age of 19. We could see that throughout almost every study that we've seen around the world, the infection rates from children to adults is very minimal compared to from adults to other adults. So when looking at teachers specifically, they were amongst the least exposed to the virus because they were in one of the safest place, which was schools. So no, I don't think that they were a population. The kids certainly weren't a population that were more at risk. The teachers certainly weren't a population that were more at risk. Now, if you're talking about some of these other positions, again, we're conflating two things. There's at risk because your job puts you in contact with people, so you're more at risk to contact the virus. But we don't just factor that in. We also factor in how deadly or how serious will the virus be if you get it. So for example, if I had to choose between 325 strapping young people that basically have no comorbidities getting this virus or one elderly person, I would choose to have the 3 young people because I know that the consequences are going to be far less extreme than the chances are with that elderly person. And the data bears this out. So the first thing we should have done was protect the people that we knew that were most at risk, not just for contracting the disease, but for having serious implications from it.
Correct. But
Sansol, and then we'll go to
you
Joe
think...
just because he had his hand up. Sansol, real quick, and then we'll go to you, Joe.
Sure.
And then we'll throw
really
back.
quick. So you're saying this is the problem that I have with this argument because it oh, one second, I just realized I didn't have my gain up. So the thing that I have a problem with in this argument, because it sounds really good on its face, and I agree, like if we could just protect the people that are most at risk, that would be preferable so that we don't have to shut down the economy, so that, you know, but it's not just old people, right? I just looked up, just quick Google, what conditions are more at risk to get seriously ill or die from COVID-19. A complete list: cancer, chronic kidney disease, chronic lung diseases, including COPD, asthma, interstitial lung disease, cystic fibrosis, etc., dementia, diabetes, type 1 or 2, Down syndrome, heart conditions such as heart failure, coronary heart disease, etc., hypertension, HIV infection, immunocompromised state, so like AIDS, liver disease, overweight and obesity, pregnancy, sickle cell disease, smoking, current or former, solid organ or blood stem cell transplant. I can go on and I can go on and go on. Do you think that it would be a better response to get every single one of the people in this country that have one of these illnesses? Cancer by itself has 1.8 million people that would fall under, to have them stay in their houses for however long the virus is ripping through the country, right? Rather than try and get the country under control. Because the way that viruses work, especially in these kind of pandemic style things, is they're going to come and then they're going to slow down and then they're going to come and they're going to slow down, waves and waves and waves. And it could last, if we don't properly restrict ourselves and restrict society, could last years, right? So if you were willing
When will it
to
stop?
round up
Also,
when will it stop? Well, I guess whenever we're able to produce the vaccine, or like it depends. Like in this, like if we were able to produce the vaccine in the same amount of time,
when did any of these?
right.
When did any other virus
Hold on,
in the
real quick.
past?
So
I'm almost done. I'm
need,
almost done.
Yeah, we need to go to Sansol, and then Rob, you're gonna have to write this down because I need to pass it to Joe because you threw him an argument and I can't let him, go and dress. So Sansol, Joe, Rob, CTV.
All right. So it seems like just like quick Google searches on a couple of the ones that seem like the highest rate of having that disease in this, like based off of this thing from the CDC, which diseases, it's like a third of our country would have to be completely locked down for however long it took, right? Rather than just trying to get under control, right? We also didn't try and get under control in any adequate way, but that's what I'm hearing from you. Like we should get everyone that has smoked now or before, would you be fine putting them in their houses, locking them up and giving them a stipend for the next, like, what, a year and a half or whatever,
Joe,
from the beginning of the lockdown?
Yeah, to Sanso's point, I'm very curious about. So the statement that Rob said was protect the most vulnerable population. Sanso was laying out that a lot of people could be categorized as a vulnerable population. So what do we do for those Americans who fall under that category? That's my question.
Okay, so good. I can answer all this. So I put a link up there. We have so far in the United States, if we accept the tally is true, based the data I have goes up to March 17th. We have 517,755 deaths. Right. So of those deaths, 14,792 plus. Let's go with I'm just doing some quick math here. So that's 20,000, 22,000, 22,000 deaths out of 520,000 have been from people over the age of 49. Oh, sorry. I got something weird going on here. How did that happen? 1 second.
Aftershock is screen sharing to the
screen
whereby.
sharing.
Oh,
if anyone
my
puts
bad.
a link,
Okay.
I'm going to share it for you guys.
Right.
Sure.
So do you see the link there? So that means that basically, what's 22,000? Let's see here. So we got 52,000 or 520,000 basically.
And this is going to help us understand.
Divided by 22,000.
Hang on. Is this going to help us understand how you would protect Americans that are categorized as most vulnerable?
Because all you have to do is look at that chart and all of those things that you just talked about, all of those comorbidities and stuff. It is clear that overwhelmingly the most important thing is age. So if you're under the age of 49, this virus had almost no chance to kill you whatsoever. It is commiserate. And particularly if you're under the age of 19, the regular flu is more deadly. If you're under the age of 49, the regular flu is about equally as deadly. Did we lock people down under the flu? No, we didn't. The vast majority of the people that we knew, the vast majority of the people that I'm talking about that we should have protected are people that are in that upper range where we can see the overwhelming majority of these deaths occurred. We knew that those people would be the most vulnerable because they have more of those comorbidities you talked about. Plus advanced age, we know from previous respiratory illnesses, makes one increasingly susceptible to things like this. So it was obvious. Now, when you talk about locking them down, I think it should have been a personal choice. If you're an elderly person, you say, I don't want to stay locked up in my house, fine. If you're in a nursing home or something, then you're not allowed back in if you expose yourself to the virus. But it should be up to the choice of the people. The point is this. You're attacking me from the position of, well, not attacking. That's not fair.
No, don't do this. Answer the question. Answer the question. You didn't answer the question.
I am answering the question.
You laid out that it was you only laid out one prescription, that it was a personal choice for individuals who were considered.
That's not what I did. You clearly didn't hear me. I said that we should have protected the people that I said, if you look at the data, the people that we needed to protect were particularly people over the age of 75. Those are the people that we needed to lock down. But protection would have been providing as many resources as possible to make sure that those people didn't have to leave their house, had more nurses so that if there was an infection spread, they were isolated, made sure that we weren't intentionally putting COVID patients in there, made sure that there were increased hospital beds and things like that and caretakers that could go from there. So if there was a spread, it would be less likely to get to more people, made sure that the PPE and things like that was going to them instead of evenly spreading it across healthy populations. Those are the things we should have done. The way that this is being approached to me is this. You're saying, but wait a minute, like then wouldn't you have to lock down everyone who ever smoked? No, because just because you have some of these comorbidities that could put you at more risk, what we should be looking at are the ones that put you at the absolute highest risk. And we can see that that comes with age. So no, if you're a 35-year-old that smokes, no, you didn't have to be locked down. Nor am I suggesting that the government force lockdowns on anyone. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, the government should have enforced lockdowns on anyone. Despite that, we could see that there were massive amounts of deaths that occurred because of lockdowns, particularly to children, their mental health issues and things like that, with even the CDC director saying more kids were killed as a result of the lockdown than of COVID.
Hold on real quick, because I
sure.
see TV. Yeah, because Rob, and then he had to respond to it. So, but this is good though. We're like transitioning. Like we got to, at the beginning, and then now we're getting into lockdowns and whether lockdowns are good, bad, and then we're getting into those arguments. But CTV, and then we'll go to Joe.
Well, I think that since we're getting into lockdowns, I don't think that we're going to see Joe or Sanso, either one, change their position, because if they did, then they would have to admit from the very start of COVID that keeping the economy open, right, and keeping the supply of goods and services moving, right, would have been the actual smart thing to do. And then isolating those that were most at risk, which would be your elderly population, away from everyone else, right? So they staying in their homes, maybe see about people bringing them food, keeping them isolated from society because they are the most at risk, but everyone else in society should have kept business as usual, right? Social distancing, which was already being put out, masks were already being talked about. Whether or not they worked at the time was kind of up in the air, but they were being talked about. So like the reality here is that they are not going to change their position, because if they did, they would have to admit that the whole last year, right, is just kind of like well, it kind of is what it is, right? The economy,
No,
took its
because
downturn. There was a
hold on.
slowdown in goods and services across
This
the
is
world,
hand waving
right?
Joe,
And
Joe's next.
position.
Unless Joe, you want to give it a Sansol, up to you.
I want
I
to
had you-
so, I mean, I wasn't done yet,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Really
go ahead,
wasn't
yeah.
done.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So because of that, what we're about to see is just a justification for the last year, and then the continuation of the policy, because that's what the party line is, rather than trying to say, okay, at this point, we definitely don't need the government to be legislating this particular thing and fining people or jailing them, right? Because we're past that point. So I'm just curious to hear what y'all are about to say.
That was incredibly weaselly. Just anything that you say from this point on
Look,
is just
Sansa.
justifying because we were right. I'm sorry, that's just really fucked.
No, I mean,
and
like, there
stupid.
is a
We'll go to
conversation.
you, Sanso, but yeah, Joe, go.
Yeah, there's a conversation to be had of what could have happened in a lot of ways, right? So like Rob laid out a few things that I agree with you, which are incredible prescriptions that I think nobody would disagree with. Unfortunately, like one of the problems is that anytime we were to try to do these certain things, people would sort of talk about infringement of civil liberties and stuff like that. As an example, right, I think that in terms of the pandemic, we should have handled Cuba's model, right? So when you entered the country, you were in a 2-week quarantine, regardless of where you came from. During that time, individuals, you would have like an assigned caretaker, so to speak, who would provide food to you during the quarantine. They would make sure that any type of sort of medical needs that you need are taken care of, any type of economic needs. So they would pay you essentially to stay home. They also made incredibly clear that you were tested so that you knew that you were an infection, a possibility of infection of yourself and others. After that 2-week grace period, they said, okay, but just make sure you wear a mask outside because not everybody is going to be potentially vaccinated yet. So this is just a temporary thing until we can get our country vaccinated at mass. Something like that in the United States would be incredibly unpopular. And something like that laid out for vulnerable population would be incredibly unpopular because we have the Constitution. So this is something, even though Rob laid out a lot of really good propositions, these are all things that the Supreme Court would just have to be in, basically just have to be on speed dial for all these states of all the challenges that they would do.
Sansol.
Okay.
Sansol and then Rob, because Sansol had his hand up.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I basically said what I was going to say originally, like
okay.
that you can't really just say like nothing that you say from this point on you can possibly defend, and you're just coping from this point on. You're just a bunch of liars. That's just incredibly weaselly. And what Joe is saying is correct. You can't in the same way that some people in chat, in Rob's chat, are saying like that's infringing on my right. Yeah, why are you like picking and choosing whose rights are being infringed on? Right? If you're saying that this is all infringing on your rights, why are you getting to be the arbiter of whose rights are being infringed instead of coming together as a nation and all doing it together? But whatever.
Okay, so I don't understand. Like again, the previously Sansol's point and Joe's point, the point before I was cut off by Joe, that I was saying that you all seem to be taking the approach of, well, you want a less lockdown type strategy, but that's a lockdown that would be bad. So Joe in this case is saying like, well, the people would have challenged this. Well, they would have challenged it less than the total lockdowns that we saw. Right.
Do you seriously believe that we could adopt Cuba's model and that wouldn't be challenged in the courts? Just that we're clear, this is a 2-week mandatory self-quarantine of yourself and everybody in your home. People come to your house. They test you on site. A nurse is provided for you that helps you with food. The government supplements that food, so you don't even have to worry about paying for that. If you're working while in the country, whether it be nationally or internationally, they cover you on leave during that time.
Okay.
Do you think that's something that could pass?
It's very frustrating. Like I get.
Do you think
right?
that's something that could pass?
Okay, so let me say, because you said Rob had a bunch of good ideas, and then you went off on this entire tangent about like Cuba. No, that's a total lockdown on everyone for 2 weeks. That should have happened. That's antithetical to everything that I said that you agreed were good ideas. The idea of telling people in nursing homes, we're going to send government resources to help you. We're going to make sure you have more nurses. We're going to make sure you have more beds. These aren't infringements of rights. So to say that the plans that I suggested would have been negative or people would have fought them in the Supreme Court, therefore we should have adopted a policy where we literally lock down everyone, including the healthy population. That is exactly what I'm indicting. That is exactly what I'm saying didn't work. There is no evidence that lockdowns worked. period. The
No, but
states
here's
that
the-
locked down more did worse, or it did
So
even.
something
The
that
states
I'm
that didn't lock down.
something that I'm in agreement with you here is that Cuba's model would not work in the United States. But something that you laid out in terms of like what we should do, you're basically alluding to Cuba's model because what
No, I'm
you
not.
argued about
How is that
vulnerable
even close, Joe?
because Cuba argued that as far as vulnerable population, which is why they did that path and they had the resources to do so.
Can I ask you real quick, just a quick answer, please? Did Cuba tell all people that they needed to lock down for 2 weeks?
If you traveled into the country outside of Cuba, you were locked down for 2 weeks.
Okay, then that's completely different than what I'm talking about, isn't it?
Do you think if you were, so let's make this a bit more statesy so we can kind of understand this.
Sure.
If you travel into my state, you are mandatorily locked down. If you want to call it a lockdown, I call it self-quarantining, mandatory self-quarantine for 2 weeks. During that time, you are financially compensated for your time that you're under there for 2 weeks. You have a caregiver. This is a literal nurse who comes, checks you, she tests you on, he or she, whoever it might be, tests you on site. Is that something that you would support?
No, it's not something I support.
Why?
Joe, would you support? Okay, real quick, Joe. Now I answered your question.
No, I'm
Would
asking you why, though. I'm asking
No,
you
no,
why.
no, no. I answered a question. Now you could answer one.
Sure.
Would you support welding everyone in their homes for 3 months?
It depends on the conditions. If the economic conditions are met so that there is no reason outside of emergency that you are inside of your home, I think that is something that most people would support. One of the problems with the lockdown.
Actually, I don't think so, Joe.
One of the
I don't think
problems
so.
with the lockdown is that we were not economically compensated for our time being locked down. We also didn't have guarantees of equitable education.
Before we go on here, I want to ask Joe if you heard me. You literally just said you would be okay with welding people in their homes.
No,
for
I just
3
didn't
months.
prescribe to your
Depending on
charged
the
language. I just did
situation.
not prescribe to your charged language on it. Welding down, I'm saying that if you gave me an offer that for 3 months, we are going to financially compensate you for your time at home. We are also going to make sure that any type of educational needs that you need during this time are met. That is something that most Americans, I would argue, were prescribed for, as long as other things, like making sure that you might have testing on site at your home.
Hey Joe, like you're missing kind of a big point when it comes to like
that anybody would support a
just
lockdown
shouting over me now isn't going to fucking work, Joe. Right? Definitely.
Real quick. Okay, Joe, you made the argument.
I need to make this point.
CTV, go ahead.
I would like to respond to it.
Yeah.
So to bring this back around to like the idea of America, right? And this is why your idea is not going to work, is something along the lines of the Third Amendment, right? You know what the Third Amendment is?
The Constitution says most of the mandates are fine, but go for what you're going to
Like, you're not understanding the philosophy here that I'm talking about, right? What you want to do is to go into someone's home and test them and all this stuff, right? Something along the same lines as the Third Amendment, right? Which says no soldier shall, okay, granted, but in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. So we're getting to property rights now. And if people don't want people coming in their fucking house, you can't have the government fucking mandate that. Right? So, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So,
the Constitution disagrees with you. And also the Supreme Court disagrees.
Did you not listen to me? This
Right.
is the philosophy.
Constitutional law scholars describe a time, place, and matter restrictions.
Yeah, hold on.
I think it is Rob's turn.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going into closing statements. So everybody, you can respond to anybody you would like. Last topic, we gave the lefties the last word. Yeah, because Sanso needs to get
I need
head out real quick.
Joe a question real quick before we go here. Just real quick.
Real quick.
Joe, is your argument to me that my plan of just helping the most vulnerable people wouldn't have been accepted by the Americans, but your plan of locking them down for 3 months would? Is that your argument?
No. You're totally just, again, like, this is why I make sure my students do continuing education, because sometimes reading comprehension you need to do outside of the 12th grade, is that you have to make incredibly sure that the economic conditions of citizens are met, regardless of the restrictions that you do.
Let me ask you a question real quick. Did you say the problem with what I suggested of helping the vulnerable people, forget about what you said. Did you say the problem with my suggestion that we should have protected the most vulnerable wouldn't have been accepted by the American people? Did you say that?
Sound Soul would argue, and again, he'd probably agree with me here. What you laid out as a most vulnerable population is not broad enough, because as we know through COVID, a lot of things can lead to you having poor outcomes of COVID-19.
But Joe,
If
you're
we just
ignoring
target the
didn't you
elderly,
initially
I
say-
would
you're
if we
ignoring the
just
question,
target
Joe.
the elderly,
With all due respect,
I would
you're ignoring the
argue
question.
it would
You're
not be
ignoring
enough.
the question. Did you not initially say that Americans wouldn't accept my plan? Did you not say that? Maybe I misheard you.
If
Didn't you say
you argue that we just target the elderly population, I doubt any state would support that, specifically because of the very other conditions that Sound Soul described. That might be okay for the
Just real
first.
quick. Didn't you say your objection was that there would be constitutional challenges? That's what you said your objection was. That's why people would object, right? You said there'd be so many constitutional challenges. That's what you said, right?
Bro, I understand that you think that I'm this like enemy, but you gotta like listen. Moving forward,
not that. I'm just trying to get a
moving
consistent
forward.
position.
I'm gonna make this
I feel like
incredibly
you're
incredibly
deflecting
clear
now,
to you as
Joe.
possible. Moving forward, you gotta listen to what I say because we wasted so much time at that. I'm not engaging with you anymore.
can you
I'm gonna
answer,
mute
did
for the
you
rest of the
say-
conversation.
Guys.
I will not
Can
do
you
a closing.
answer? Did you say that or not?
Guys,
You can't
okay,
answer.
cool.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a good convo. Got a little heated, but it's all good. Okay, so closing statements, and we'll get into some questions that I got here. So the lefties got the last word on the last one, so I'll let the people on the right go first. So Sansa, why don't you start us off? Closing statement. 2 minutes, sir.
Yeah, sure. I don't know how we're ever going to have conversations like this if there's so many assumptions being given to the intent of the lockdowns. It always seems like there's there's all these like nirvana fallacies. Like if we were able just to like find all the people that were vulnerable to COVID and then put them into some situation to where they're not going to get COVID, then we could just have like a perfect open society where until we get the vaccine, we can keep our economy open. But unfortunately, things are much more complex than that, and it doesn't seem like we can ever engage because I don't even know what to say on this. My entire fucking brain is riddled with cancer. I would love to find some way to have a conversation about this. I don't think it's fucking possible because people are very ideologically driven. I want less people to die. I don't know what the purpose is of arguing about Trump versus Biden. We didn't even get into that. We just started arguing about who the fuck is the deadest state. I don't know. It's just fucking stupid. This was a fucking useless fucking conversation.
All right. By the way, Sansa, if you need to head out and if you don't want to stay for
head
questions, that's all good. Okay. Cool.
If people want to, if you have a list of questions, you can copy and paste them and send them to me. I'll answer every single one of them on my stream. But I have a conversation that I was supposed to have. I didn't know it was going this long.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and we're still on for next week.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
we'll see you next week. Thank you so much for coming in, Clutch, man. I appreciate you.
All right, catch you guys later.
See ya. All right, so CTV, go ahead.
Oh, I thought it was the left first.
It was Sonsel, but we're letting a righty have the last say, so it'll be like Rob or you or whatever.
I got you. New format. Okay, so Rob, I love you, bro. Got to learn to like bring back the bear energy just a little bit.
It won't happen.
So just a little bit, right? I love you, but like we've had this conversation. But to COVID, the Fourth Amendment, right, is pretty clear. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched or the persons or things to be seized. Right, Joe? So this is where anybody looking at this says, oh, well, the government can just mandate that we're going to go into your house, right? We're going to give you a shot against your will. No bueno. No bueno, right? So, and I get like, I get where you guys are coming from, but the reality is that, what is it, 520,000 deaths so far? Is that what the number that was up on the screen earlier?
Yeah, close to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So like the number that was back in January, right, and before transition to the new administration, that number was like 496, right? So it seems to me like the number of deaths has been dropping off compared to what they were. So we're seeing a slowdown in this thing, and that has probably a lot to do with the fact that once you get it, right, like it's done, you know. So the thing that's going, like, it's not like that people, if they feel like that they're at risk or they know that they're at risk, right, them separating themselves from people, keeping your distance. If you feel like you need to wear a mask, right? You as the individual ultimately have the most control over what's going on in your life. No one else has that control, right? So thank you for, well, I guess thank you to me for filling in, but
Where can we find you, CTV? Let us know.
you can find me in the Wolf's Den, right? So feel free to drop over to Critically Thinking Veteran on Twitch. You can find me on Twitter.
Did I just lose him? Whoa. What just happened? I lost audio. I don't know if you can hear me, but I lost audio from Discord. Not too sure what's going on.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you through here, yeah.
Interesting.
So I don't know if it's something from the browser.
Rob, go ahead and just mute yourself from Discord and then just unmute yourself on Whereby.
Yeah, let me give me like 30 seconds or like 10, maybe 15. I just reset.
So okay, gotcha.
So maybe there's a thing there. All right, let me Discord is not open. There it is.
Sorry.
Yeah, Discord
Rob?
bugged out, so I'm gonna end the task and then reopen it.
Rob, can you hear me? Technical difficult. Go back to Discord, Rob.
I can
Go
hear
back to
Joe.
Discord.
Yeah.
Yeah, Joe's gonna reset.
Yeah, I'm coming in right now.
Oh,
Okay. All right. There we go.
Hello.
There we go. Hey.
Nice. All right, CTV. You got to make it quick though.
Yeah. So Joe, like, at some point, like when you're having these conversations too, man, like, I get that you're a real chill dude, but like, try to listen to what Rob is saying at the same time too, because
Absolutely.
I feel like there's a lot of talking past on a lot of these panels, and this is why like keeping the energy down is important, and where the person's coming from is important, and then maybe not using so much filler, right? And maybe kind of get to where you're going with it, because I feel like sometimes whenever you're talking, it's a lot of filler, man.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, one of the things that I'm actively trying to work on is making sure that just my point is directly to the point. And one of even my frustrations in the conversation that we had is that, or just this conversation at large, is that I felt that it took a very long time for us to get very direct for what we're going to say. And then even when it came to on both sides of the ball, directly answering questions immediately so we can move forward in the conversation just wasn't sufficient. So I think that was definitely a critique that can be done on both sides. And that's something I'm working to make sure I improve moving forward.
All right, and by the way, we'll
that also works as my closing as well.
That's you.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, we'll also do plugs after the questions, by the way, that I have here. So I think that'll work better. So go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, so for my closing first, I'll just repeat everything I said, that we should have protected the vulnerable. I don't think Trump did perfect. When it comes to how Biden did, Biden just seems to be instituting the plans that Trump had already had. He would have been worse on the things we know about as far as open borders, things like that would have spread the virus worse, particularly on these issues. Like, this is just one of my incredible frustrations that I have oftentimes. And I know I get angry and get vocal, but it seems like I try to answer questions pretty directly. I feel maybe I could get a little better on that, but you could even see at the end, it seems like the conversation is always dictated by people on the left that want to ask me questions that I answer, then want to ask, then I answer, then want to ask, then I answer, and it never goes the other way. I don't know how we can have conversations if we can't agree on the metrics of things, of how we're going to judge whether something was successful or not. And so when we could look, I think almost every expert in the country would say, yeah, New Jersey did really bad. If they're not the worst, they're amongst the worst for how they handled COVID. And it was shocking to hear someone say, no, actually they did good. I don't know how we could have a conversation if you think that having the highest per capita death rates almost in the entire world somehow was a good effect. Also, the vaccination numbers weren't quite as Joe had said. 88% was the percentage of the vaccines they have that they gave out. In reality, it's only about 18% of the population of New Jersey that's been vaccinated, which puts them still in the top third, but that's not by no means something to celebrate. And then real quick, the point at the end, I don't understand. Like, there's just seems to be this lack of logical consistency in argument that I constantly see. Like, I'm objected to me saying we should have protected the vulnerable by saying there would have been constitutional challenges to that. Instead, what we should have done is lock people in their homes for 3 months. And there's so many there's a problem with locking people in their homes for 3 months, which we could talk about, such as how will the economy keep going to continue to send people money and food if no one's working in farms to produce food because you've locked everyone down for 3 months? Like, that's a big problem. But the bigger problem that I have with it is it doesn't consistently follow an argument. If your argument is, Rob, I think your plan would have been challenged because people would have said you can't infringe on rights by protecting these elderly people first. Therefore, I suggest a plan that is far more restrictive, but say that the majority of Americans would have accepted that and not had constitutional challenges. This is where my frustration comes from, because it's just like, I don't even know how to deal with this argumentatively. It's literally like I'm arguing with people on either side of me, and it's the same person that's just making contradictory arguments. So maybe I gave the opportunity 4 times. I asked, did I hear you wrong? Is that what you said? He refused to answer and made some snide comment about how I need to have better than a 12th grade reading comprehension or something like that. So I don't know. I guess that's where we're at. But all you need to take away from this is, how can you have a conversation with someone who thinks that the state that did the worst about COVID was one of the best?
Yeah, I mean, I can.
Okay. Well, no.
Yeah,
we're going to questions. Yeah,
sure.
And for sure. And I know how to make this better in regards to the rules and stuff like that. So it'll be a much better convo from here on out as well. I think we had a couple of miscommunications, and I think a couple of rules will help.
Critique for you, Aftershock, was you need to learn what a server mute is, and not just muting.
Dude, I was just muting you guys individually, and I thought you guys were muted for everybody. It was just for
I
me.
mean, that was even
I was
before
like, you
I
guys
got
are muted.
here.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I was sitting there. We were watching it. We were watching it in the Wolf's Den, and I'm like, Aftershock does not realize that he has only muted himself.
That's my bad. So yeah, okay. So let's get to some questions. So the first one, and so some of these are a bit loaded, obviously lenient in some ways, but what are you gonna do? So Ripe for Parody asks, and I'm pretty sure this is for the right-leaning people. When Trump told Bob Woodward on February 7th, 2020, that he knew that the virus was worse than the flu, why do you think Trump continued to go out in March, April, and beyond telling people that the flu was worse?
Who do you want to take that?
I'm guessing it's the right-leaning people, since I don't think the lefties are going to defend Trump or even promote.
So I'll defend it by Joe and the people in the chat. Is Anthony Fauci someone we should trust when it comes to COVID?
Anthony Fauci was put in an incredibly difficult position where he had to function as a health communicator as well as one of the leaders of the COVID-19 task force. So by any metric, it was in a lose-lose situation. I would argue that
he's someone that we should listen to.
I argue that he failed Americans.
So you don't think we should? So I'll just say what Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert.
That was one of those yes or no's that could have done that, Joe.
Yes.
We don't get answers like that. So yes, we should listen to him. Okay, good. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert, defended President Trump on Wednesday Tuesday after audio recordings revealed that the president wanted to downplay the severity of the coronavirus early in the pandemic. Speaking with Fox News' John Roberts, Fauci denied that he ever heard the president distort the threat of the coronavirus and maintained Trump's presentations to the public were largely in line with discussions he had had with medical experts. So Trump was doing what medical experts recommended that he do. He didn't want to incite fear. He didn't want to incite a bunch of people running out. Remember, we had people that were panic buying toilet paper and things like that. So when his experts are telling him this is how you should present this to the public and he does it, how are we then saying that we should blame Donald Trump when the very person that's tasked, that still to this day is the front man with dealing with this, says he thinks Trump did exactly what was being recommended by the doctors?
Okay, so and by the way, if anybody wants to respond or if you want to counter, you can. If not, it's perfectly okay. So this next question is from Nimman Gavi W. And this kind of goes to Mr.
Oh,
Roof One.
just call them Gravy. Their name is Gravy.
Sure,
Gravy.
So they're kind of the same question. So I'll like put them together. So Gravy says, why doesn't the Trump administration get credit for developing quickest vaccine in history? And Mr. Move says, does Joe give full credit to Trump for the vaccine? And anybody can take this, but I mean,
what kind of fucking stupid ass question is that? Listen, Trump got the vaccine first. Yes, he got it first. But however, the question is under Operation Warp Speed. I'll give it to Donald Trump that he was able to do it good, but I'm not going to give him a pass like he just that one thing absolves him of everything. So that's a fucking stupid ass question to ask.
I don't see how like.
If I can,
real quick though,
that's both of the chatters,
a rule,
not to anyone on the panel.
A rule though, the question that is if the question directly asks somebody a question, that person gets the last word. We can't have it like, because then it's gonna cascade into another argument. So Rob, go ahead, and then Joe will get the last word on it.
Okay, fine.
Yep.
That's literally the exact opposite of everything Joe started this topic out on. He said the only thing that matters about New Jersey is the vaccine, so the rest of the stuff didn't matter. Then when it comes to Trump, he says, yes, Trump's responsible for the vaccine, but I'm not going to give him the benefit of the doubt and the rest of the stuff. This is what I'm talking about, why it's impossible to have a conversation like this.
Sure, we'll have it in private.
Okay, cool.
What? Wait. That seems confusing.
So Gravy asks again. Gravy asks. Ask why leftist Dr. Fauci has no repercussions for lying.
Because politicians don't have consequences for their lies.
Sorry, I missed that. So one more time. Sorry.
Politicians have no consequences for their lies.
He's not a politician.
Dr. Fauci is in a position of power where he functioned as a health communicator. He functions as a politician at that point. He failed Americans. No leftist should defend him.
And can I say something real quick, just because I see something being misrepresented in the chat? I've never once in this episode or anywhere said that I don't believe the vaccine works, ever. Never said it. When Joe asked earlier, when I said, well, if we take that as true, what I was saying was not the specific report that he's saying that say vaccines do X, Y, and Z. I was saying that the idea that vaccines will completely solve this problem. Let's assume that's true. I haven't seen evidence of that. Remember, even Dr. Fauci's out there after being vaccinated wearing 2 masks. Rand Paul has grilled him because he said, look, all scientific evidence shows that you don't really spread the virus once you have the vaccine. So why is Dr. Fauci out there wearing 2 masks? So please don't misrepresent me as saying that I'm an anti-vaxxer or have said that the vaccines don't work. I have never said that, not once. Nor have I said that about masks, which I wear a mask almost everywhere. So I'm tired of being misrepresented. That's not what I said. I didn't say it in this debate. I never said it. And if anyone wants to pull up where they think I've said that in the past, I welcome.
So that was the last question. So Joe, where can we find you, man?
Yeah, on twitch.tv/Joe Lewis, the O's a 0.
Gotcha. Rob, where can we find you?
Rob Noor on Twitch, just like it's spelled there, all one word, lowercase. Normal America with Rob Noor on YouTube. If I ever get my strike lifted, we'll see if that happens. And I'm also on D Live with Normal America.
Gotcha. CTV one more time.
Critically Thinking Veteran. You can find me on Twitch, YouTube, blah, blah, blah.
All right, guys. Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Guys, next week we have Rob and counterpoints versus Sonsol and socialism done left. And their topics are going to be socialism versus capitalism. And then we're going to have a discussion on gun laws. So we'd really love to have you. It's going to be a really exciting show. And thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe, follow, make sure to follow the panelists as well. We really appreciate them. And it was a great discussion, guys. I'll see you guys later.
See you. Take
Thanks.
care.
Hey,
Good
man.
night. Don't panic. Don't picnic. Don't picnic. I see a picnic. Hey. All right. We're back. Let's get some Muzak. Let us get some Muzak. How's everyone doing? Hold on, I'm just doing a housekeeping message. All right, so, whoa, dance call. Oh.